My wife texted going on a trip with my ex. Don't be jealous, I replied. Don't worry, I won't be here when you get back. My name is Marcus Hale, and at 38 years old, I thought I'd seen enough bullshit to last me a lifetime. Boy, was I wrong. Life has this twisted sense of humor where just when you think you've got things figured out, it sucker punches you right in the gut with a text message that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the person sleeping next to you every night. It was a Thursday evening. Nothing special, just another mind-numbing day at the office where I pushed papers around and pretended to care about quarterly reports. I dragged myself home to our cramped two-bedroom apartment, the one Clara always complained wasn't stylish enough for her Instagram photos. You know the type. Exposed brick walls and Edison bulbs weren't cutting it for her aesthetic anymore. I was sprawled on our beat-up couch, the same one she'd been nagging me to replace for 2 years, when my phone buzzed with that familiar ping that usually meant she was asking me to pick up groceries or reminding me about some friend's birthday party I'd rather skip. Instead, what I saw made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Going on a trip with my ex, don't be jealous. 6 words. 6 fucking words that managed to demolish 4 years of what I'd stupidly believed was a solid relationship. Not even a phone call, not even the decency of a face-to-face conversation. Just a casual text, like she was telling me she'd grabbed milk from the store. The sheer audacity of it hit me harder than the betrayal itself. Don't be jealous? Don't be jealous? Lady, you just announced you're gallivanting off with the same douchebag who cheated on you 3 times before we got together, and you're telling me not to be jealous like I'm some insecure teenager throwing a tantrum. I stared at that message for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, and for a hot minute, I considered doing what the old Marcus would have done, typing out some pathetic plea, asking her to reconsider, maybe even offering to take time off work so we could go somewhere together instead. The Marcus who'd spent 4 years bending over backwards, working double shifts to cover her half of the rent when her freelance graphic design career wasn't paying the bills. The Marcus who'd pretended not to notice when she'd come home at 2 a.m. claiming she'd been networking at some artsy event downtown. But something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the casual cruelty of her message, or maybe it was the sudden clarity that hit me like a freight train. I'd been playing the fool for way too long. All those late nights when she'd flip her phone face down the second I walked into the room. All those mysterious girls' nights that somehow never included any of the girls I actually knew. All those times she'd pick fights with me right before going out, like she needed to justify something to herself. Clara had always been what my buddy Leo called a chaos junkie, someone who thrived on drama, who needed the emotional roller coaster to feel alive. She'd start arguments just to make up passionately later, create problems just so she could be the one to solve them, and apparently, now she was creating the ultimate chaos by running off with her ex just to see if I'd come crawling after her. Well, surprise, surprise, princess. This time, Daddy wasn't going to chase. My fingers moved across the screen with a steadiness that surprised even me. Don't worry. I won't be here when you get back. Send. The satisfaction that washed over me was immediate and intoxicating. For 4 years, I'd been the stable one, the responsible one, the guy who paid the bills while she found herself. I'd been her safety net, her backup plan, her reliable Marcus who would always be there no matter how badly she treated me. But you know what? Even the most patient man has his breaking point, and mine had just been obliterated by a text message that read like it was written by a sociopath. I could practically picture her face when she read my response. She'd probably expected me to blow up her phone with desperate calls, maybe even show up at wherever she was staying to beg her not to go. That's what had happened the last time she'd pulled this shit. 2 years ago when she'd reconnected with an old college friend who turned out to be another ex. I'd played right into her hands then, pleading with her to stay, promising to be better, to pay more attention, to be more spontaneous. What a fucking joke that had been. This time was different. This time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Freedom. Pure, unadulterated freedom from her emotional manipulation, her constant need for validation, her exhausting drama. It was like someone had lifted a weight off my chest that I didn't even realize I'd been carrying. I looked around our apartment, our so-called love nest, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. The place looked like a shrine to her narcissism. Her yoga mats taking up half the living room, Her organic skincare products covering every surface in the bathroom. Her collection of self-help books about living your best life, stacked everywhere except actually being read. The few things that were mine had been relegated to corners, like I was a guest in my own home. The irony wasn't lost on me. She thought she was punishing me by running off with her ex, but all she'd really done was hand me the keys to my own prison cell. For 4 years, I'd been living my life on her terms, walking on eggshells, trying to be the perfect boyfriend to a woman who saw me as nothing more than a comfortable backup plan. Well, congratulations, Clara. You just freed me from the worst relationship decision I'd ever made. My phone sat silent on the coffee table, and I knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Soon enough, she'd realized that her little power play had backfired spectacularly. She'd probably start with confused texts, then move on to angry ones, and finally resort to the tears and apologies that had worked so well in the past. But this time, I had something I'd never had before, the absolute certainty that I was done being her emotional punching bag. The evening stretched ahead of me, quiet and full of possibilities I hadn't dared to imagine in years. That night, I began to pack, and let me tell you, there's something almost therapeutic about dismantling a life that was never really yours to begin with. I didn't storm around the apartment throwing shit into boxes like some unhinged ex-boyfriend in a rom-com. Nope. This was methodical, surgical even. Every shirt folded with military precision. Every drawer emptied with the kind of calm that would have scared the hell out of Clara if she'd been there to witness it. The silence in our apartment was deafening, but not in a lonely way. More like the quiet you get right before a massive thunderstorm breaks. You know that moment when the air gets thick and everything goes still, and you can practically taste the electricity? That's exactly what this felt like, except instead of waiting for lightning, I was creating my own damn storm by packing up 4 years of what I'd foolishly called love. I started with my clothes, because let's face it, that was the easy stuff. T-shirts, jeans, the handful of button-downs I wore to work. Everything Clara had always complained made me look too corporate or not artistic enough. Well, guess what, sweetheart? I wasn't trying to be artistic. I was trying to be a functioning adult who paid bills and showed up to work on time. Concepts that seemed to elude her completely. As I folded each piece of clothing, I couldn't help but notice how little space my stuff actually took up. 4 years of living together, and my entire wardrobe fit into 2 medium-sized boxes. Meanwhile, Clara's clothes had somehow metastasized throughout the entire apartment like some kind of fashionable cancer. Her vintage band t-shirts, from bands she'd never actually listened to, hanging in the closet, her collection of statement jackets draped over every chair, her army of barely worn shoes lined up like soldiers ready for battle they'd never see. Moving on to my books was where things got interesting. I'd always been a reader, science fiction mostly, some history, a few biographies of people who'd actually accomplished something with their lives. Clara used to mock my boring reading choices while her own bookshelf was packed with self-help garbage with titles like Unleash Your Inner Goddess and The Art of Not Giving AF***CK. The irony of that last one wasn't lost on me, considering she gave way too many F***CKs about everything except our relationship. Each book I packed felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. These were conversations we'd had, worlds I'd escaped to when her drama became too much to handle. She'd always interrupted me when I was reading, claiming I was ignoring her or being antisocial. Looking back, I realized those interruptions weren't about wanting my attention. They were about controlling it. God forbid I have 5 minutes of peace without her being the center of my universe. Then came the real gut punch, our framed photos, or as I now like to think of them, evidence of a 4-year delusion. There was our trip to Portland last spring, where she'd spent the entire weekend complaining about the rain and posting filtered selfies to make it look like she was having the time of her life. There was Christmas at my parents' house, where she'd charmed everyone with her free spirit, while I cringed internally, knowing she'd spend the drive home picking apart everything my family had said or done. But the photo that really got to me was the one from our 2nd anniversary dinner. I remembered that night so clearly. I'd saved up for weeks to take her to this fancy restaurant downtown, the kind of place where they don't list prices on the menu because if you have to ask, you can't afford it. She'd worn this red dress that made her look absolutely stunning, and for a few hours, I'd actually believed we were happy. In the photo, We're both smiling, my arm around her waist, looking like the perfect couple. What the camera didn't capture was what happened 20 minutes after that photo was taken. She'd spent the entire dinner on her phone, texting someone she claimed was just a friend from work. When I gently asked if she could put it away for our anniversary dinner, she'd exploded, accusing me of being controlling and insecure. We'd left early, spent the drive home in stone-cold silence, and I'd ended up sleeping on the couch that night because she was too upset to have me in the bedroom. Looking at that photo now, I could see what I'd been too blind to notice then. Her smile never reached her eyes. She was already checked out, already looking for the exit, already planning her next move. I'd been so desperate to make us work that I'd convinced myself those moments of happiness were real instead of just breaks between the chaos. I packed the photos face down, not because I was angry, but because I finally understood they were fiction. We'd never been the couple in those pictures. I'd been the guy desperately trying to hold on to something that was never really there, and she'd been the actress playing the role of devoted girlfriend while auditioning for her next part. The kitchen was next, and holy shit, did that tell a story. My coffee maker, the one appliance I'd insisted on when we moved in together, sat there like a loyal friend. Clara had always mocked my obsession with good coffee, preferring her sugary Starbucks concoctions that cost more than most people's lunch. But every morning for 4 years, I'd made coffee strong enough to fuel a small city, because that's what kept me functional enough to deal with her constant emotional tornado. My books, my coffee maker, my clothes. It was pathetic how little I'd actually contributed to this space. Everything else screamed Clara. Her decorative candles that she never lit, her collection of succulents that I'd kept alive because she always forgot to water them, her vision board on the refrigerator covered with pictures of places she wanted to travel and things she wanted to do, none of which included me. By midnight, my entire life fit into the back of my Honda Accord. For years of what I'd thought was building a future together, and I could pack it all up in a few hours. That should have been depressing, but instead, it felt liberating as hell. I wasn't leaving behind a home. I was escaping a beautifully decorated prison cell. As I loaded the last box into my car, I took one final look at our apartment. The place looked exactly the same, just with a few empty spaces where my stuff used to be. It was like I'd never really lived there at all, like I'd been a ghost haunting someone else's life for 4 years. I didn't slam the door behind me. I didn't even look back. I just locked it, slipped the key under the mat, and walked away from the biggest mistake of my adult life with the kind of quiet dignity that would have pissed Clara off more than any screaming match ever could. The next morning, my phone exploded like a goddamn fireworks show on the 4th of July, except instead of celebrating freedom, Clara was having a full-blown meltdown in my text messages. I'm talking rapid-fire notifications that would have made a machine gun jealous. My phone was buzzing so aggressively, I thought it might vibrate itself right off the nightstand of my crappy motel room. Yeah, that's right. I'd spent my first night of freedom in a Motel 6 that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. The kind of place where the ice machine sounds like it's having an existential crisis, and the wallpaper pattern looks like it was designed by someone having a bad acid trip in 1987. But you know what? It was mine. No Clara, no drama. No walking on eggshells. Just me, a lumpy mattress, and the sweet sound of absolutely nobody else's bullshit. Clara's text marathon started around 7 a.m., which was rich considering she'd never been awake before noon unless there was some kind of emergency or a sample sale at her favorite boutique. Her first message was almost cute in its confusion. Wait, what do you mean you won't be here? Like she genuinely couldn't comprehend that actions might have consequences. It was followed immediately by "Where did you go?" and then, "Marcus, this isn't funny." Isn't funny? Lady, I wasn't trying to be a comedian. I was trying to be a man with an ounce of self-respect, something I'd apparently misplaced somewhere around year 2 of our relationship. But here's the thing that would have blown her manipulative little mind. I didn't respond. Not to the first text, not to the 20th, not to any of them. I just sat there in that shitty motel room, drinking coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through old gym socks, watching her panic unfold in real time through my phone screen like the world's most satisfying soap opera. The evolution of her messages was pure psychological gold. Stage 1 was confusion mixed with that entitled attitude she'd perfected over the years. Are you seriously upset about this? It's just a trip. Just a trip. Right. Because taking off with your ex-boyfriend who you'd spent 3 years telling me was a toxic asshole was totally just a casual vacation. No big deal. Nothing to see here, folks. Stage 2 was where things got interesting. The messages started coming faster, with more typos, which meant she was either drunk or genuinely panicked. Probably both, knowing Clara. This is ridiculous, followed by you're being childish, followed by my personal favorite. I can't believe you're throwing a tantrum over this. A tantrum. Because apparently, having enough self-respect to walk away from someone who treats you like garbage is the emotional equivalent of a toddler losing their shit in the cereal aisle. By noon, she'd moved into stage 3, bargaining. Look, if you're really this upset, I won't go. Too little, too late, sweetheart. The damage was done the second she thought it was okay to announce her little adventure via text message, like she was updating her Instagram story. We can talk about this like adults, she wrote, which was hilarious coming from someone who'd never had an adult conversation about anything more serious than what to order for dinner. But the real entertainment started around 2 p.m. when she shifted into stage 4, full-blown desperation with a side of manipulation. Where are you? Please answer me. I'm worried about you. This isn't like you. And there it was, the classic Clara move of making herself the victim in a situation she'd created. She wasn't worried about me. She was worried about losing control of the narrative. The messages kept coming like a digital avalanche. She tried guilt. For years, Marcus. You're going to throw away for years over this. She tried logic. We can work through this if you just talk to me. She even tried reverse psychology. Fine. If you want to be immature about this, that's your choice. Each message was a window into her psychological playbook, and I was finally seeing the game she'd been playing all along. Meanwhile, I was doing something I hadn't done in years, exactly what I wanted to do. I drove around town with no destination in mind, windows down, music loud enough to drown out the sound of my phone buzzing. I stopped at a diner I'd been wanting to try for months, but never could because Clara thought diners were beneath her sophisticated palate. I ordered a burger and fries and ate every greasy, delicious bite without someone across from me complaining about processed food and empty calories. The freedom was intoxicating. No schedule to keep except my own. No mood to manage except mine. No drama to navigate. No eggshells to tiptoe around. No emotional landmines to carefully sidestep. For the first time in 4 years, I could just exist without having to justify my existence to someone else. By evening, I'd found a modest rental across town. Nothing fancy. Just a one-bedroom apartment with hardwood floors that creaked when you walked and a balcony that overlooked a quiet street lined with oak trees. The landlord was this old guy named Frank who didn't give a shit about my relationship drama, just wanted first month's rent and a security deposit. Cash transaction, keys in hand, done deal. As I stood on that creaky balcony, watching the sun set over a neighborhood I'd never lived in before, my phone buzzed one more time. Clara's final message of the day. I don't understand what I did wrong. And that right there. That complete lack of self-awareness, that inability to see how announcing a romantic getaway with an ex via text message might be hurtful, that was everything I needed to know about why this relationship had been doomed from the start. I could have explained it to her. I could have written a novel-length response breaking down exactly what she'd done wrong, how she'd treated me, why I was done. But you know what's more powerful than words? Silence. Complete. Absolute, deafening silence. She'd spent 4 years talking at me, talking over me, talking around me, but never really talking to me. Now it was my turn to communicate, and I was saying everything I needed to say by saying absolutely nothing at all. The silence was my response, my statement, my final answer. And in a world where Clara had always been the loudest voice in the room, my silence was the most powerful thing I'd ever said. 2 days later, my phone rang. And for a split second, I thought it might be Clara trying a different approach to break through my wall of silence. But no, the caller ID showed Leo Carter, and suddenly I realized I was actually excited to talk to another human being. Funny how you don't realize you've been living in isolation until someone throws you a lifeline you actually want to grab. Leo and I had been buddies since college, back when we were both young and stupid enough to think we knew everything about life. He'd watched my entire relationship with Clara unfold like a slow-motion car crash, and to his credit, he'd tried to warn me more than once. But you know how it is when you're neck deep in someone else's crazy. You can't see the forest for the trees, and you definitely can't see the red flags for the rose-colored glasses. Marcus, dude. Leo's voice came through the phone with that particular mix of disbelief and sympathy that told me he'd already heard Clara's version of events. What the hell is going on? Clara's been blowing up everyone's phones telling them you left her over some harmless trip she wanted to take. I had to laugh at that. Harmless trip. Right. Like taking a romantic getaway with your ex-boyfriend is the equivalent of going to visit your grandmother in Florida. The audacity of this woman never ceased to amaze me, even when I thought I'd reached my limit for being amazed by her bullshit. Let me guess, I said, settling into the creaky chair in my new apartment. She's painting herself as the victim in this whole situation, right? Poor little Clara, abandoned by her heartless boyfriend who couldn't handle her free spirit. Pretty much, yeah, Leo confirmed, and I could hear him trying not to laugh. But here's the thing, man, nobody's buying it. I mean, some people are being polite about it, but anyone who's spent more than 5 minutes around you two knows what's really going on here. That hit me harder than I expected it to. For 4 years, I'd been so worried about what people thought of our relationship, so concerned with maintaining the facade that everything was perfect, that I'd never stopped to consider that maybe our friends weren't as blind as I'd been. Maybe they'd been watching me slowly disappear into Clara's drama and wondering when I'd finally wake up. She's telling people you threw a tantrum over her going on vacation, Leo continued, and I could practically hear him making air quotes through the phone. But dude, everyone knows about her ex. Everyone knows what kind of vacation this really is. The fact that you didn't fight, didn't beg, didn't make a scene, that's what's eating her alive. And there it was. The truth I'd been too close to see clearly. Clara had always thrived on chaos, on drama, on the emotional roller coaster of fighting and making up. She needed the intensity, the tears, the passionate reconciliations that made her feel like she was living in some kind of romantic movie where she was the star and I was the supporting character whose only job was to chase her around and beg for her attention. You know what the crazy part is? Leo went on, and I could tell he was just getting warmed up. She actually seems confused about why you left. Like, genuinely confused. She's telling everyone she doesn't understand what she did wrong, and that you're being unreasonable. It's like she lives in a completely different reality than the rest of us. That tracked. Clara had always had this amazing ability to rewrite history in real time, to take situations where she was clearly in the wrong and somehow twist them around until she was the injured party. It was like watching a master magician at work, except instead of pulling rabbits out of hats, she was pulling victimhood out of situations where she was the one holding the knife. The thing is, Leo said, and his voice got more serious, everyone's been waiting for this moment for years. We've all watched her treat you like shit, watched you bend over backwards trying to make her happy, watched you lose yourself in her crazy. When someone texted me that you'd finally walked away, my first thought wasn't, oh no, poor Clara. It was, thank God, he finally grew a spine. Ouch. But also, yeah, fair point. I had been spineless for way too long, hadn't I? I'd been so afraid of being alone, so terrified of admitting that I'd wasted 4 years of my life on someone who saw me as nothing more than a convenient safety net, that I'd let her walk all over me until I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. She's also been trying to get people to call you, Leo added with a chuckle, asking mutual friends to talk sense into you and convince you to stop being stubborn. But here's the beautiful part. Nobody wants to do it. Like, nobody. Even the people who like Clara are basically telling her she made her bed and now she gets to lie in it. The satisfaction that washed over me was immediate and warm. For years, I'd felt like I was the crazy one, like I was the problem in our relationship. Clara had this way of making me feel like every issue between us was somehow my fault. I wasn't attentive enough. I wasn't spontaneous enough. I wasn't understanding enough of her complex emotional needs. But hearing that our friends had been watching the same shit show I'd been living and coming to the same conclusions I was finally reaching, that was validating in a way I hadn't expected. You want to know the best part? Leo asked, and I could tell he was grinning. Jake ran into her at that coffee shop downtown yesterday. You know, the pretentious one she always drags people to because they have oat milk or whatever. He said she looked like hell. Dark circles under her eyes. Hair a mess. The whole 9 yards. And when he asked how she was doing, she just started crying right there in line. I should have felt bad about that. The old Marcus would have felt guilty, would have started second-guessing himself, would have wondered if maybe he was being too harsh. But the new Marcus? The one who'd finally remembered what self-respect felt like? I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. She'd made her choice when she sent that text. She'd rolled the dice and lost, and now she was learning what it felt like to face consequences for once in her privileged little life. The truth is, man, Leo said, his voice getting serious again, you did the only thing you could do. You didn't fight, you didn't beg, you didn't give her the drama she was looking for. You just walked away with your dignity intact. And that's what's driving her absolutely insane. Dignity. Yeah, I like the sound of that. For the first time in years, I had my dignity back, and it felt better than any relationship ever had. A week later, I was just settling into the rhythm of my new life when Clara showed up at my door like a bad penny that keeps turning up when you least want to see it. I'd been enjoying a quiet Saturday morning in my creaky little apartment, drinking coffee that actually tasted good and reading a book without someone interrupting me every 5 minutes to complain about literally everything under the sun. Then came the knock. Not just any knock, mind you. This was the Clara special, urgent, demanding, with that particular rhythm that said, I'm important and you need to drop everything right now to deal with my feelings. 3 sharp raps, pause, 3 more raps, like she was some kind of emotional Morse code operator sending out distress signals. I knew it was her before I even looked through the peephole, but I looked anyway, because sometimes you need visual confirmation of the train wreck that's about to hit your peaceful morning. And there she was, looking like she'd been through a blender set on emotional breakdown. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, no makeup, wearing those ratty yoga pants. She only broke out when she was having what she liked to call a moment of authentic vulnerability. Marcus, I know you're in there, she called through the door, her voice doing that trembling thing that used to make me cave instantly. We need to talk. You can't just throw everything away like this. Oh, but I could. And I was. Standing there on the other side of that door, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete control over my own life. She could knock until her knuckles bled. She could cry until she dehydrated herself. She could camp out on my doorstep like some kind of romantic movie stalker. None of it was going to make me open that door. I don't understand what happened, she continued, and I could hear her leaning against the door now. 1 minute everything was fine, and the next minute you're gone. It was just a trip, Marcus. I needed space to figure things out. Space. That magic word again. The only time Clara ever needed space was when it involved another man, usually an ex-boyfriend who'd suddenly reappeared in her life like a recurring infection. She never needed space when I was paying her half of the rent because her freelance career wasn't covering her expensive taste in organic everything. She never needed space when she wanted me to drive her to the airport at 5 a.m. because Uber was too expensive. She never needed space when she needed someone to listen to her complain about her friends, her family, her job, or whatever other crisis was currently consuming her self-absorbed little world. I know I should have talked to you about it first, she said, and I had to give her credit. She was hitting all the right notes in her apology symphony. But I didn't think you'd react like this. I thought you trusted me. Trust her? I trusted her right up until the moment she announced via text message that she was running off with her ex-boyfriend like it was the most natural thing in the world. I trusted her through all those late nights when she came home smelling like someone else's cologne. I trusted her through all those mysterious phone calls she had to take in the other room. I trusted her right up until my trust finally died of exhaustion from being constantly abused. The knocking started up again, more urgent now, with that edge of panic that meant she was finally starting to understand that her usual manipulation tactics weren't working. You can't just disappear like this. It's been a week, Marcus. A week. I've been worried sick about you. Worried sick. Right. She'd been worried sick about losing her safety net, her backup plan, her reliable Marcus who would always be there to clean up her messes and pay for her mistakes. But worried about me as a person? About my feelings, my well-being, my happiness? That was rich coming from someone who'd spent 4 years treating me like an emotional support human whose only job was to make her feel better about herself. I called your work, she said, and I could hear the desperation creeping into her voice now. They said you took some personal time. Where are you staying? Are you okay? Please just talk to me. Personal time. Yeah, I'd burned through some of my accumulated vacation days to give myself space to breathe, to think, to remember what it felt like to be a human being instead of an extension of Clara's ego. My boss had been surprisingly understanding when I'd explained that I was going through a life transition. He'd even made a joke about midlife crises, which would have been funnier if I hadn't been dead serious about needing to rebuild my entire existence from scratch. I know I made a mistake, Clara continued, and here we were getting to the heart of her manipulation playbook. The admission of fault, delivered with just the right amount of vulnerability to make me feel like a monster for not instantly forgiving her. I should have talked to you first. I should have been more considerate of your feelings. But Marcus, you're the love of my life. You're my person. I can't lose you over this. Love of her life. Her person. The same person she'd casually informed via text that she was taking a romantic getaway with her ex-boyfriend. The same person whose feelings she'd never once considered before making any major decision in 4 years of what I'd foolishly thought was a partnership. If I was the love of her life, then I felt genuinely sorry for any other poor bastard who might come after me. The crying started then. Real tears, not the crocodile variety she usually deployed when she wanted something. I could hear her sliding down the door, probably sitting on my doorstep now like some kind of abandoned puppy. And you know what? Part of me wanted to open that door. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, to fall back into the familiar pattern of being her emotional caretaker. But a bigger part of me, the part that had finally remembered what self-respect felt like, stayed right where I was. Because this wasn't about love anymore. Hell, maybe it had never been about love. This was about respect, about basic human decency, about treating your partner like an actual partner instead of a convenient accessory to your life. She'd had 4 years to figure out how to respect me, and she'd failed spectacularly. Now she could figure out how to live without me. Days bled into weeks, and Clara's approach to winning me back evolved like some kind of twisted psychological experiment. What started as desperate pleas and crocodile tears slowly morphed into something uglier. Something that showed me exactly who she really was underneath all that fake vulnerability. And honestly, it was the best thing that could have happened, because it made walking away feel less like abandoning someone I loved and more like escaping a psychological prison I'd been too blind to recognize. The text messages came in waves, each one more revealing than the last. At first, she tried the pity party approach. I can't eat. I can't sleep. I'm falling apart without you. Classic Clara, making everything about her suffering while completely ignoring the fact that she'd caused this whole mess in the first place. It was like watching someone complain about getting wet after deliberately jumping in a swimming pool. When the pity party didn't work, she switched to bargaining mode. I'll cancel the trip. I'll never talk to him again. I'll do whatever you want if you just come home. Too little, too late, sweetheart. The damage wasn't just in the trip itself. It was in the casual way she'd announced it. The complete disregard for my feelings, the assumption that I'd just roll over and take whatever she dished out, because that's what I'd been doing for 4 years. But it was when the bargaining phase failed that things got really interesting. That's when Clara's mask finally slipped, and I got to see the real person I'd been sharing a bed with all this time. The shift was so dramatic, it was almost impressive. Like watching Jekyll transform into Hyde, except Hyde had better hair and a victim complex the size of Texas. You never loved me, came the first venomous text, arriving at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday like some kind of midnight revelation. If you really loved me, you wouldn't abandon me like this. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. She was accusing me of not loving her because I refused to stick around and be treated like garbage. In Clara's twisted logic, love meant accepting whatever scraps of affection she felt like throwing my way while she gallivanted around with other men. The next message was even better. You're heartless. You're cold. You were just waiting for an excuse to leave me. Waiting for an excuse? Lady, I'd had excuses coming out of my ears for 4 years. I could have left when she spent our vacation fund on a shopping spree without telling me. I could have left when she forgot to invite me to her company Christmas party because her ex was going to be there. I could have left when she started picking fights with me every time she wanted to go out without me. But I hadn't left. I'd stayed, like an idiot, thinking that love meant enduring endless bullshit in silence. You were looking for any reason to run away because you're scared of real intimacy. she texted the next day, and I had to laugh at that one. Scared of real intimacy? I'd spent 4 years trying to get intimate with someone who kept me at arm's length emotionally, while expecting me to be available for her every whim. Real intimacy would have involved her actually talking to me before deciding to take a romantic vacation with her ex-boyfriend, instead of announcing it like a weather update. But the real masterpiece came a few days later. I hope you're happy. You've destroyed the best thing that ever happened to you. The best thing that ever happened to me. Right. Because being someone's emotional punching bag and financial safety net, while they treated me like an inconvenient roommate, was definitely the pinnacle of human experience. Each poisonous message she sent felt like another chain falling away from my ankles. For years, I'd been walking around carrying the weight of her emotional instability, her financial irresponsibility, her complete inability to consider anyone's needs but her own. I'd convinced myself that this weight was love, that caring for someone meant accepting their worst behavior and trying to fix them through patience and understanding. But watching her true colors emerge in those text messages was like having a fog lift from my brain. This wasn't love. This was emotional abuse disguised as romance. She'd spent 4 years conditioning me to believe that her happiness was my responsibility, that her problems were mine to solve, that her moods were mine to manage. And when I finally stopped playing that game, she revealed exactly what she thought of me. The freedom that came with each nasty message was intoxicating. I wasn't losing the love of my life. I was escaping someone who'd never really loved me at all. She'd loved what I could do for her, how I made her feel about herself, the stability I provided while she played out her endless dramas. But me as a person, my thoughts, my feelings, my dreams, those had never mattered to her. I started taking evening walks without needing to check in with anyone, without having to explain where I was going or when I'd be back. I went to the gym for the first time in 2 years because Clara had always complained that my workout schedule was selfish and took time away from her. I called up old friends I'd lost touch with because Clara found them boring and preferred hanging out with her crowd of fellow drama addicts. Each day that passed without her chaos felt like another small victory. I woke up when I wanted to wake up, ate what I wanted to eat, watched what I wanted to watch on TV without someone criticizing my choices or demanding we watch one of her pretentious foreign films instead. The silence in my apartment wasn't lonely. It was peaceful in a way I'd forgotten was possible. The really beautiful part was watching her lose control of the narrative. For 4 years, she'd been the director of our relationship drama, deciding when we fought, when we made up, what we fought about, how it got resolved. She'd controlled the emotional thermostat of our entire life together, turning up the heat when she needed attention and cooling things down when she wanted space to pursue other interests. But now she was just another person sending desperate messages to someone who didn't give a damn anymore. She had no power over my emotions, no ability to manipulate my responses, no way to pull me back into her web of manufactured crises. She was shouting into the void, and the void wasn't shouting back. The poison she was spitting was just showing me how lucky I was to finally be free of it. One evening, while I was enjoying a beer on my creaky balcony and actually reading a book for pleasure instead of having it interrupted every 5 minutes by manufactured drama, my phone buzzed with a text from Leo. It wasn't his usual message. This one had that urgent energy that meant someone had just stepped in a massive pile of their own bullshit, and he couldn't wait to share the spectacle. "Dude, you need to see this." The message read, followed by a screenshot that made me nearly spit out my beer laughing. Clara just posted this on Instagram. The comments are fucking brutal. There it was, in all its desperate glory. A picture of Clara and her ex, some douchebag named Derek, who looked exactly like what you'd expect from a guy who'd convinced 3 different women to take him back after cheating on them. They were at some trendy rooftop bar, probably spending money. She didn't have to create the illusion of living her best life. Clara was wearing this forced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the kind of expression you see on hostages in proof-of-life photos, while Derek had his arm around her with the smug look of a guy who thought he'd won some kind of prize. But the real masterpiece was the caption. "True love never dies. 2 hearts. #second chances. #soulmates. #living my truth." True love never dies. Jesus Christ, the audacity was breathtaking. This was the same woman who'd spent the last month blowing up my phone with messages ranging from desperate pleas to venomous attacks. And now she was posting inspirational quotes about eternal love with the same guy who'd cheated on her with her own roommate 3 years ago. The hashtags were the cherry on top of this shit Sunday. Hashtag second chances. More like hashtag third or fourth chances, considering Derek's track record. Hashtag soulmates. Sure, if your soulmate is someone who treats commitment like a suggestion and fidelity like an optional upgrade. Hashtag living my truth. The only truth she was living was that she'd rather be with someone who treated her like garbage than admit she'd fucked up the best relationship she'd ever had. But here's where it got really good. The comments section was an absolute bloodbath, and Clara had walked right into it with her eyes wide open. Leo had screenshotted the best ones, and reading them was like watching a masterclass in social media karma. "Didn't you have a boyfriend like last month?" wrote Sarah, one of Clara's college friends who'd clearly been keeping track of the timeline. "This is the same guy who cheated on you, right?" asked another mutual acquaintance, apparently not buying into Clara's revisionist history. But my personal favorite came from Marcus's cousin Jenny, who'd never particularly liked Clara but had always been polite for my sake. Some people really love being treated like shit, I guess. Different strokes for different folks. Woman shrugging. The passive-aggressive emoji was the perfect touch, just enough plausible deniability to avoid being called out directly, but savage enough to draw blood. Jenny had always been good at that kind of surgical social media strike. Even better were the reactions from people who knew both of us. Instead of the flood of hard eye emojis, and you go girl. Comments Clara had probably been expecting. She was getting a masterclass in why you don't air your relationship drama on social media when everyone knows you're full of shit. "Where's Marcus in all this?" asked one of our mutual friends, apparently not buying Clara's narrative that I'd just disappeared into thin air for no reason. "Wasn't this posted from the same restaurant Marcus took you for your anniversary last year?" observed another friend with the kind of attention to detail that Clara probably wasn't counting on. That observation hit different, and I could practically see Clara's face falling as she realized people were connecting dots she'd hoped would stay disconnected. Yeah, that was the same rooftop bar where I'd spent a week's salary trying to give her a perfect anniversary dinner, only to have her spend the entire evening texting Derek about some emergency that turned out to be him being lonely after his latest girlfriend dumped him. The really beautiful part was watching Clara try to control the damage in real time. She started responding to comments with increasingly desperate attempts to maintain her narrative. Sometimes you have to follow your heart, even when others don't understand red heart, and not everyone is brave enough to fight for real love flexed biceps. But the internet is undefeated when it comes to calling out bullshit, and Clara was learning that lesson the hard way. For every inspirational platitude she posted, someone else would drop a truth bomb that exposed another layer of her self-deception. "Brave enough to fight for real love," Leo texted me. "Or stupid enough to fall for the same bullshit twice." Faced with tears of joy. The whole thing was like watching someone step on a rake in slow motion. You could see the disaster coming from a mile away, but they were too invested in their own delusion to change course. Clara had always been addicted to social media validation, constantly posting carefully curated glimpses of our relationship to make it look like we were living some kind of fairy tale. Now she was using the same playbook with Derek, except this time everyone knew the behind-the-scenes story. What really got me was the timing. A month ago, she'd been crying on my doorstep, telling me I was the love of her life and begging me to take her back. Now she was posting about true love, with the same guy who'd broken her heart so badly that she'd spent 3 months on my couch eating ice cream and making me promise I'd never treat her like he had. But here's the thing that would have shocked the old Marcus. I didn't feel angry looking at that picture. I didn't feel jealous or hurt or betrayed. I felt nothing but cold satisfaction and maybe a little pity for Derek, who clearly had no idea what he was signing up for. Because I knew something that Derek was about to learn the hard way. Clara didn't want love. She wanted chaos. She didn't want a partner. She wanted an audience. And Derek, poor bastard, had just volunteered to be the next supporting character in the ongoing drama series that was Clara's life. The comments kept coming, each one more brutal than the last, and I realized that Clara had inadvertently done me the biggest favor possible. She'd shown everyone exactly who she really was, and they weren't buying what she was selling. Sometimes the best revenge really is just letting people expose themselves. A month later, Clara returned, But this time she wasn't the smug, self-righteous woman who'd announced her romantic adventure via text message. Nope. This version of Clara looked like she'd been put through an emotional blender set on reality check. And honestly, it was both satisfying and pathetic to witness. I was coming home from the gym. Yeah, I'd actually been going to the gym regularly since escaping her emotional prison. When I spotted her sitting on the steps outside my apartment building. At first, I thought maybe I was hallucinating, because the woman hunched over on those concrete steps looked nothing like the confident, free-spirited goddess who'd been posting inspirational quotes about living her truth just weeks earlier. Her hair, usually styled to Instagram perfection, was pulled back in a greasy ponytail that screamed, "I haven't showered in 3 days." Her eyes were so swollen from crying that she looked like she'd gone 10 rounds with a heavyweight boxer. She was wearing the same ratty sweatshirt she'd had since college, the one she only broke out during her deepest depressive episodes, and her hands were shaking as she clutched a tissue that had clearly seen better days. When she looked up at me, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the casual cruelty of that text message, the month of venomous accusations when I wouldn't come crawling back, and the social media circus where she'd tried to parade her true love in front of everyone who knew better. "Marcus," she said, and her voice was so hoarse it sounded like she'd been crying for weeks. Which, judging by her appearance, she probably had been. I made a mistake. I made the biggest mistake of my life. No shit, Sherlock. But I didn't say that. I just stood there, gym bag in hand, looking down at the wreckage of the woman who'd thought she could trade up from someone who actually loved her to someone who'd already proven he was a piece of shit. "I thought he'd changed," she continued, the words tumbling out like she'd been rehearsing this speech for days. "I thought maybe we were both different people now, that we could make it work this time. But he hasn't changed, Marcus. He's exactly the same selfish, lying asshole he always was." The irony was so thick I could taste it. She'd spent 4 years with someone who'd treated her well, who'd been faithful, who'd bent over backwards to make her happy, and she'd thrown it all away for a guy who'd already shown her exactly who he was. But somehow, she'd convinced herself that Derek 2.0 would be different from Derek 1.0, despite all evidence to the contrary. "You were the stable one," she said, and there was something in her voice that I'd never heard before. Genuine regret mixed with desperation. "You were the one who actually cared. You never lied to me, never cheated on me, never made me feel like I was worthless. And I threw it all away for a fantasy." A fantasy. Finally, a moment of actual self-awareness from someone who'd spent the better part of our relationship living in a carefully constructed delusion where she was the victim of everyone else's inability to understand her complex emotional needs. "I know I hurt you," she went on, and the tears were flowing freely now. "I know I treated you terribly, and I know I don't deserve another chance. But Marcus, you're the only good thing that ever happened to me. I was too stupid to see it when I had it, but I see it now." And there it was, the speech I'd fantasized about hearing for months when I was still invested in our toxic relationship. The acknowledgement of my worth, the admission that she'd been wrong, the recognition that she'd lost something valuable. A few months ago, these words would have been music to my ears, validation for every sleepless night I'd spent wondering if I was crazy for thinking I deserved better. But standing there looking down at her, I felt something I hadn't expected, absolutely nothing. No surge of triumph, no desire to comfort her, no inclination to say, "I told you so." Just a flat, emotionless observation of someone who'd finally run out of people to blame for her own bad decisions. "Derek started seeing someone else 2 weeks into our romantic getaway," she continued, apparently interpreting my silence as an invitation to keep talking. "Some girl he met at the hotel bar. He didn't even try to hide it from me, just told me I was too needy and that he needed variety in his life. He left me stranded in Miami with a hotel bill I couldn't pay and a plane ticket I had to beg my parents to help me change." Part of me wanted to laugh at the poetic justice of it all. She'd left a stable relationship for a fantasy, and the fantasy had turned into a nightmare so predictable that everyone except Clara had seen it coming. Derek had done exactly what Derek always did, used her for whatever he needed and then discarded her when something shinier came along. "I called you so many times from the airport," she said, and her voice cracked completely now. "I just wanted to hear your voice, to know that maybe I hadn't destroyed everything good in my life. But you never answered. You never answered any of my calls. Of course I hadn't answered. By that point, I'd learned to recognize her number and send it straight to voicemail. I'd been too busy rebuilding my life to get sucked back into her drama, too focused on remembering what peace felt like to voluntarily return to chaos. "Please, Marcus," she said, and now she was looking up at me with those red-rimmed eyes that used to be my weakness. "I know I don't deserve it, but please give me another chance. I'll do anything. I'll change. I'll go to therapy. I'll never talk to Derek again. I'll be the woman you deserve. The woman I deserve." As if she could just flip a switch and become someone different, someone capable of basic respect and consideration. As if 4 years of emotional manipulation could be erased by a few weeks of consequences catching up with her. I looked at her for a long time, this broken woman who'd once held so much power over my happiness, and realized that the spell was completely broken. She wasn't the love of my life. She was just another person who'd learned too late that actions have consequences. I looked at her for a long time, calm as the night air around us, watching this broken woman who'd once controlled every aspect of my emotional life, like she was conducting some twisted orchestra where I was always playing second fiddle to her drama. The silence stretched between us, heavy with 4 years of history and 1 month of absolute clarity that had changed everything. Clara sat there on those concrete steps, clutching that soggy tissue like a lifeline, waiting for me to say something that would give her hope. Her eyes were searching my face for any sign of the old Marcus. The one who would have immediately dropped to his knees to comfort her, who would have started apologizing for her pain even though I hadn't caused it, who would have convinced himself that her suffering somehow erased all the bullshit she'd put me through. But that Marcus was gone, killed off by a text message and buried under a month of the most peaceful solitude I'd experienced in years. The man standing here now was someone who'd remembered what self-respect felt like, what it was like to sleep through the night without wondering what crisis would greet me in the morning, what it meant to make decisions based on my own needs instead of constantly managing someone else's emotional temperature. "You want to know something, Clara?" I finally said, my voice steady and calm in a way that seemed to surprise her. "A month ago, these words from you would have meant everything to me. I would have seen your tears and thought they were proof that you finally understood what you'd lost. I would have heard your apologies and convinced myself that they meant you'd actually changed." She looked up at me with something like hope flickering in those red-rimmed eyes, probably thinking this was the beginning of my forgiveness speech, the part where I'd tell her that love conquers all and we could work through anything together. "But here's the thing," I continued, and I could see that hope starting to dim as she realized where this was heading. "I don't want your apologies anymore. I don't want your promises to change or your desperate attempts to convince me that you've finally figured out my worth. Because you know what, Clara? You knew my worth all along. You just didn't give a damn about it." The words came out measured and deliberate, each one carefully chosen and delivered without a trace of the anger or bitterness she was probably expecting. This wasn't a furious rant from a wounded ex-boyfriend. This was a calm statement of facts from someone who'd finally seen the situation clearly. "You didn't leave me for Derek because you thought he'd treat you better," I said, watching her face crumble as I spoke. "You left me for Derek because you thought I'd always be here waiting when he inevitably let you down. You gambled our entire relationship on the assumption that I was too weak, too desperate, too pathetic to walk away from you." She opened her mouth to protest, but I held up a hand to stop her. I wasn't done yet, and after 4 years of being interrupted every time I tried to express a thought or feeling, I was damn well going to finish this conversation on my terms. "The saddest part is that you were almost right," I continued. "For 4 years, I did exactly what you expected me to do. I absorbed your moods. I made excuses for your behavior. I convinced myself that love meant accepting whatever scraps of affection you felt like throwing my way. I was so afraid of losing you that I lost myself instead." The tears were flowing freely down her face now, but they didn't move me the way they used to. I'd seen this performance too many times, had fallen for it too often, had allowed myself to be manipulated by the sight of her pain into forgetting about my own. "But you made one crucial miscalculation," I said, and now there was something in my voice that made her look up sharply. "You assumed that because I'd put up with your bullshit for 4 years, I'd put up with it forever. You thought you could push me as far as you wanted and I'd always come crawling back, grateful for whatever crumbs of attention you decided to give me. Clara was sobbing openly now, making those ugly crying sounds that she'd always hated anyone to witness. The woman who'd spent 4 years carefully controlling her image, who'd never let me see her at anything less than her best, was completely falling apart on my doorstep. "I did love you, Clara," I said, and these were the hardest words to say because they were still true, even after everything. "I loved you enough to work double shifts to pay for your dreams. I loved you enough to pretend I didn't notice when you came home smelling like someone else's cologne. I loved you enough to convince myself that your problems were mine to solve." She looked up at me then with something like desperation, probably hearing the past tense, but still hoping that love could be resurrected, that feelings that strong didn't just die because of one mistake. "But love isn't enough without respect," I continued, and this was the truth I'd learned during my month of freedom. "And you never respected me, Clara. Not once in 4 years. You saw me as a safety net, a backup plan, a convenient solution to your problems. But you never saw me as an equal partner whose feelings mattered as much as yours." The silence that followed was deafening. She sat there on those steps, processing the reality that this wasn't a negotiation or a discussion. This was a closing statement. The trial was over, the verdict was in, and there would be no appeals. "You made your choice when you sent that text message," I said quietly. "You chose Derek over me, chaos over stability, drama over love. I made my choice when I walked away. I chose myself for the first time in 4 years, and it's the best decision I've ever made." Her tears fell faster now, but my resolve didn't shake. I'd spent too many nights watching her cry to be moved by it anymore. I'd learned the hard way that her tears weren't always genuine remorse. Sometimes they were just another manipulation tactic, another way to make her pain more important than anyone else's. "This is goodbye, Clara," I said with a finality that seemed to hit her like a physical blow. "Not see you later, or maybe someday. This is goodbye forever. You wanted to know what life was like without me. Now you get to find out." She left in silence, finally understanding that some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. Life didn't magically fix itself after Clara walked away from my doorstep that final time. And anyone who tells you that dumping toxic people instantly transforms your existence into some kind of Instagram-worthy paradise is selling you bullshit. But here's what did happen. For the first time in 4 years, I wasn't constantly bracing for impact, waiting for the next emotional bomb to explode in my face, or walking on eggshells around someone whose mood could shift faster than a politician's promises during election season. The silence in my apartment wasn't the oppressive kind that makes you want to fill it with noise just to prove you're still alive. It was the good kind of quiet, the kind where you can actually hear yourself think instead of constantly monitoring someone else's emotional weather patterns. I could eat cereal for dinner without someone lecturing me about nutrition. I could watch whatever I wanted on Netflix without having to endure another 3-hour foreign film about the profound existential crisis of modern womanhood. I could go to bed when I was tired instead of staying up until 2 a.m. providing free therapy for someone who never bothered to ask how my day went. The gym became my new church, and let me tell you, there's something almost spiritual about deadlifting twice your body weight when you're no longer carrying the emotional baggage of someone who treated commitment like a hobby they could pick up and put down whenever something more interesting came along. I wasn't trying to get revenge body ripped or anything that dramatic. I was just rediscovering what it felt like to do something purely for myself, without having to justify it to someone who saw my personal time as time stolen from her. Work became tolerable again, too. Turns out it's a lot easier to focus on quarterly reports and client presentations when you're not getting passive-aggressive texts every hour about how you never prioritize the relationship or how you're emotionally unavailable because you can't drop everything to discuss her latest friend drama. My boss even commented on my improved attitude, which was hilarious because I hadn't realized how much Clara's constant chaos had been bleeding into every aspect of my life. But the real transformation was in my social life. Leo and I started hanging out regularly again, something that had been nearly impossible during the Clara years because she'd always found reasons why she needed me more than my friends did. We'd grab beers after work, shoot pool on weekends, have actual conversations about sports and work and life without me having to cut everything short because someone was having a crisis that required my immediate attention. You know what's crazy? Leo said one evening as we were watching the game at our favorite dive bar. You're actually fun to be around again. For the last couple years, it was like hanging out with someone who was constantly waiting for bad news. He wasn't wrong. I'd spent so much time in survival mode, managing Clara's emotions and anticipating her next dramatic revelation, that I'd forgotten how to just exist in the moment. Every conversation, every plan, every simple pleasure had been filtered through the lens of, how will Clara react to this? And what will this cost me in terms of relationship drama later? The dating app stayed deleted though, not because I was pining for Clara or harboring some secret hope that she'd come crawling back with a better apology, but because I was genuinely enjoying my own company for the first time in years. I was rediscovering who Marcus was when he wasn't constantly adapting himself to fit someone else's ever-changing definition of the perfect boyfriend. I took up cooking, something Clara had always mocked as too domestic, while simultaneously expecting me to handle all the grocery shopping and meal planning. Turns out I'm actually pretty decent at it when I'm not trying to accommodate someone who changes her dietary restrictions every other week based on whatever wellness influencer she's currently following. I started reading again. Really reading, not just skimming articles between crisis management sessions. Science fiction, history, biographies of people who'd actually accomplished something meaningful with their lives instead of just posting inspirational quotes about living authentically while treating everyone around them like supporting characters in their personal drama. The occasional updates about Clara came through the social media grapevine, and they painted exactly the picture you'd expect. She'd bounced back to Derek twice more after our final conversation, each reconciliation lasting about as long as a Hollywood marriage before imploding in spectacular fashion. Her Instagram became a masterclass in performative healing, filled with quotes about learning to love yourself and releasing toxic people from your life, apparently without a trace of irony about who the toxic person actually was in most of her relationships. But here's the beautiful thing. I didn't feel vindicated by her continued disasters. I didn't feel superior or satisfied or even particularly interested. She'd become irrelevant to my life in the most complete way possible, not through anger or bitterness, but through simple indifference. She was just another person making bad decisions somewhere else, no longer my problem to solve or my chaos to manage. 6 months after that final conversation on my doorstep, I ran into her at the grocery store. She looked exactly like you'd expect someone to look who'd spent half a year ping-ponging between toxic relationships and posting cryptic Facebook statuses about finding her truth. Tired, a little desperate around the edges, trying too hard to project confidence while clearly falling apart underneath. She saw me first, and I watched her face cycle through about 6 different emotions in 3 seconds. Surprise, hope, calculation, disappointment, and finally resignation. For a moment, I thought she might try to approach me, maybe attempt one more pitch for why we should give it another shot. But something in my expression must have communicated what words couldn't. That ship hadn't just sailed. It had sunk to the bottom of the ocean and been claimed by the fish. I nodded politely, the way you'd acknowledge any casual acquaintance, and kept walking. The sweetest revenge wasn't proving her wrong with words or gestures or dramatic confrontations. It wasn't showing up to places where I knew she'd be with someone new, or posting carefully curated social media content designed to make her jealous. The sweetest revenge was simply living better without her, and meaning it. I was leading a rescue mission in Iraq when the hospital called. "Your daughter is in critical condition," the nurse said. "Your wife's new husband hurt her." And the detective won't act his brother is the police chief without knowing who I am. Next morning, military at their door. You know what they don't tell you about war zones? It's not the bullets that'll mess you up, it's the damn phones. Mine was buzzing like an angry hornet against my Kevlar vest while I'm trying to shepherd a terrified kid through an alley that looked like God's own garbage disposal. The dust was so thick you could chew it, and the rotor wash from our birds overhead was turning the whole street into a sandblaster convention. Perfect timing for a phone call, right? The kid couldn't have been more than 8. Had his tiny fingers wrapped around mine like I was his personal lifeline to not becoming street pizza. His dark eyes kept darting between the rubble and my face, probably wondering if this giant American with the funny accent was going to get him killed or get him home. I was leaning toward the latter, but hey, the day was young. That's when my sat phone decided to have a cardiac episode against my ribs. Now, let me be crystal clear about something. I don't take calls during extractions. Ever. It's like answering your phone during brain surgery or checking Instagram while your house is on fire. You just don't do it. But something in my gut, that part of me that's pure dad DNA and nothing else, made me hit that green button like it owed me money. Your daughter is in critical condition. Just like that. No hello. No, is this a good time? No gentle lead-in. Just a verbal sledgehammer to the solar plexus. The nurse on the other end had this voice, scared but steady, like she'd been practicing this conversation in her head for hours. Her name was Aisha Karim, she said, calling from St. Gabriel Children's Hospital. Even through the static and the sound of my world imploding, I could tell she was the real deal. Your wife's new husband brought her in, Aisha continued, and I swear I could hear her choosing each word like she was defusing a bomb. He claimed she fell. The injuries don't match the story. I called a detective, but he won't act. His brother is the police chief. My head started ringing like I'd been standing too close to an IED. Lily, my baby girl, my ex-wife Julia, who'd apparently traded up to some yahoo named Brent O'Malley while I was playing soldier overseas. And the cherry on top of this garbage sundae, the police chief's brother was Detective Carl Mercer, who apparently thought justice was optional when family was involved. You ever have one of those moments where time splits in half? Half of me was still in that dusty alley, holding on to this scared kid, watching my team move toward the extraction point like we'd done 100 times before. The other half was already on a plane, already in that hospital room, already figuring out which heads needed to roll. It's a weird feeling, being in two places at once. Wouldn't recommend it. Listen to me very carefully, I told Nurse Aisha, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. I need you to photograph everything. Every bruise, every mark, every damn thing that doesn't look right. Seal my daughter's clothes in evidence bags. Do it right, chain of custody style. Keep that medical chart locked down tight. Can you do that for me? Already done, she said, and I could have kissed her through the phone. I've been a pediatric nurse for 12 years. I know what abuse looks like. I turned to Sergeant Leo Drake, my second in command, who was giving me that look, the one that said I was about to do something spectacularly stupid and he was going to have to clean up the mess. Leo's good people. Former Detroit cop who joined the Army after his partner got gunned down by some tweaker with more drugs than brain cells. He understands that some lines you don't cross. Drake, you've got point, I said, handing him the tactical lead like I was passing him a live grenade. Execute the extraction protocol. Everyone goes home. Sir, you're breaking about 17 different protocols right now, he said, but his tone was more worried than insubordinate. Command's gonna have your ass for breakfast. I looked at him, then at the kid still clinging to my hand, then at the chaos swirling around us like the world's worst snow globe. Protocol doesn't raise my kid, Sergeant. Protocol doesn't tuck her in at night, or help her with math homework, or scare away the monsters under her bed. And protocol sure as hell doesn't keep some piece of garbage from putting his hands on her. Drake nodded once, sharp, military. Understood, sir. We'll handle the cleanup here. You go handle yours. That's when I called in a favor that was going to cost me big time. Major Quentin Rhodes owed me for that mess in Kandahar where I'd pulled his sorry, but out of a firefight that should have been his last day on Earth. Quincy's got more pull with the brass than a freight train, and when I told him I needed emergency leave and transport back to the States, he didn't ask questions. Just said, consider it done. 21 minutes later, we were wheels up, and I was staring at the desert disappearing beneath us like a bad dream. But I wasn't thinking about sand or insurgents or the mission we'd just completed. I was thinking about 3 names I'd scratched onto my knee board with a tactical pen: Brent O'Malley, Detective Carl Mercer, and Chief Alan Mercer. See, here's the thing about guys like me. We don't do emotional outbursts. We don't show up screaming and throwing punches like some yahoo in a bad action movie. That's amateur hour stuff. When you've spent years learning how to dismantle networks of bad guys who think they're untouchable, you develop a different approach. You learn to pull levers instead of triggers. You learn to apply pressure in all the right places until the whole rotten structure comes tumbling down. I wasn't coming home to shout or cry or have some dramatic confrontation in a hospital corridor. I was coming home to wage war, the quiet kind, the methodical kind, the kind that starts with phone calls and paperwork and ends with handcuffs and orange jumpsuits. Because these clowns had made one crucial miscalculation. They thought being connected would protect them. They thought their little boys' club of badges and favors would keep them safe. They were about to learn the difference between local politics and federal intervention. They were about to discover that some fights you can't win by knowing the right people or greasing the right palms. And most importantly, they were about to find out what happens when you mess with a soldier's kid. The plane banked toward home, and I started making my list. 21 minutes. That's how long it took to go from holding a scared kid's hand in a dust bowl to strapping myself into a military transport that was hauling ass toward the States like its tail was on fire. In the civilian world, 21 minutes gets you through a decent sitcom episode or a really slow Starbucks line. In my world, 21 minutes was enough time to completely flip the script on everything I thought I knew about my life. The heat coming off that Iraqi runway looked like reality was having a stroke, all wavy and distorted, like someone had cranked the contrast knob on the universe until everything looked fake. But sitting there in that cargo hold, watching the desert shrink to nothing through a porthole the size of a dinner plate, the only thing that felt real was the white-hot ball of rage sitting in my chest like a coal that wouldn't burn out. You know what they don't tell you about emergency flights? The silence. Sure, the engines are screaming and the whole bird is shaking like it's coming apart at the rivets. But inside your head, it's dead quiet. Just you and whatever demon you're carrying across the ocean. Mine had a name. Actually, it had 3 names, all scribbled on my knee board in handwriting that looked like I'd been writing during an earthquake. I pulled out my encrypted phone, the kind that makes the NSA proud, and started typing messages to the only 3 people on planet Earth who could help me turn this nightmare around. First up was Colonel Miriam Stone, retired, my old commanding officer who'd basically invented the art of getting things done without asking permission from every pencil pusher between here and Washington. Miriam's got this reputation for being able to move mountains, and by mountains, I mean bureaucrats who think their job is to sit on their hands while kids get hurt. Miriam. I typed, keeping it short because encrypted messages aren't the place for war and peace. Need a federal favor. Child abuse case. Local PD compromised. Moving fast. We'll explain when boots hit ground. Second message went to Rafael Ortiz, this investigative journalist who'd been chasing corruption stories like a bloodhound with a journalism degree. Rafa's got this annoying habit of being right about everything, especially when it comes to cops who think their badges make them bulletproof. Word on the street was he'd been sniffing around the Mercer family for years, just waiting for someone to crack the door open wide enough for him to stick his foot in. Rafa, I pecked out. Remember that Mercer story you've been sitting on? Today's your Christmas morning. Call you when I land. The third message was the longest, because it was going to Priya Desai, and Priya doesn't do anything halfway. She's this child advocacy social worker who knows the system better than the people who built it. Every loophole, every pressure point, every way to make bureaucrats squirm when they're trying to sweep something under the rug. If you want someone who can navigate hospitals and courtrooms like she's got GPS coordinates for justice, Priya's your girl. Priya, incoming child abuse case, potential law enforcement obstruction. Need someone who knows hospitals and courts. Speed is everything. Details when I'm stateside. Hit send on all 3, then leaned back against the cargo netting and tried not to think about what Lily looked like right now. That's a dangerous road, letting your imagination run wild when your kid's in the hospital and you're stuck in a flying metal tube somewhere over the Atlantic. Your brain starts painting pictures you can't unsee, and before you know it, you're planning 17 different ways to commit homicide without leaving fingerprints. Instead, I focused on what I knew for sure. Systems protect the people who build them. That's not some philosophical bullshit. That's cold, hard reality. Cops protect cops, politicians protect politicians, and everybody else can get bent. It's not personal, it's just how the machine works. But here's the thing about machines. They've got weak points. Pressure points. Places where you can stick a crowbar and watch the whole thing come apart like a cheap watch. The Mercer brothers thought they had the perfect setup. Chief Alan Mercer runs the police department like his own personal kingdom, and Detective Carl Mercer handles anything that might embarrass the family. Neat, tidy, bulletproof. Except they forgot one tiny detail. Federal jurisdiction trumps local politics every single time. You can own every cop in town, but you can't own the FBI. You can control the local newspaper, but you can't control a journalist with national connections. My phone buzzed with responses faster than I expected. Colonel Stone was in. No questions, no hesitation, just a crisp "Roger that." Standing by. Raphael sent back a string of Spanish profanity that roughly translated to "Hell yes. Let's burn these bastards down," but in much more colorful language. Priya's response was the longest, a detailed breakdown of what she'd need to build an airtight case, complete with contact information for federal agents who specialized in cases involving law enforcement corruption. The plane hit some turbulence, and for a minute I felt like I was back in that dusty alley with mortars dropping too close for comfort. But this wasn't random violence. This was personal. Some jackass with a badge and a family connection had decided my daughter was expendable, that her pain was an acceptable price for his convenience. That was their first mistake. Their second mistake was thinking geography was going to protect them. See, they figured I was safely tucked away in a war zone, playing soldier while they played house with my family. They thought distance meant safety. What they didn't realize was that the same training that made me good at hunting bad guys overseas worked just fine on the home front. The ocean stretched out below us like a challenge. All that water between me and Lily, like someone had drawn a line in the sand and dared me to cross it. But I wasn't some weekend warrior dad who was going to show up and make a scene. I was a professional problem solver, and the Mercer family had just become my next assignment. I closed my eyes and started planning. Not the angry, emotional kind of planning that gets you arrested for assault. The cold, methodical kind that gets results. By the time we touched down, I'd have a federal task force, a journalist with a grudge, and a social worker who knew every judge in the state. The Mercers were about to learn the difference between local influence and federal heat. Wheels down in 6 hours. Game time. You know what hits you first when you walk into a children's hospital? It's not the antiseptic smell or the squeaky clean floors that look like someone attacked them with a fire hose and industrial bleach. It's the silence underneath all the noise, the kind of quiet that comes from kids who are too hurt to cry and parents who've run out of prayers. St. Gabriel Children's Hospital had that silence in spades, hanging in the air like smoke you can't wave away. Nurse Aisha Karim was waiting for me at the ER doors like she'd been planted there. And let me tell you something. This woman didn't mess around with pleasantries. No, "How was your flight?" Or "Thanks for coming so quickly." Just a sharp nod and eyes that said she'd seen enough bullshit to last 3 lifetimes. She had this way of walking that reminded me of the good sergeants I'd served with. Purposeful, like every step was calculated to get her exactly where she needed to be without wasting a single second. "Room 314, she said, leading me through corridors that were too bright, too white, too clean for the kind of darkness we were dealing with. "I need to warn you before we go in. It's worse than what I described on the phone." Worse. The word hit me like a gut punch, but I kept walking because that's what you do. You put one foot in front of the other until you get where you need to be, even when every instinct is screaming at you to turn around and find the nearest punching bag. The elevator ride lasted about 17 years, with Muzak playing some butchered version of Yesterday that made me want to rip the speakers out with my bare hands. Room 314 was a monument to everything wrong with the world. Too white, too sterile, too full of machines that beeped like electronic heartbeats counting down to something nobody wanted to think about. But none of that mattered once I saw Lily lying in that hospital bed, looking smaller than I remembered, paler than any 8-year-old should ever look. The bruises were what got me first, dark purple fingerprints wrapped around her wrist like some sick piece of jewelry. But it was the marks on her back that made me taste copper and see red around the edges of my vision. You don't get marks like that from falling downstairs or tripping over toys. You get marks like that from someone who enjoys causing pain, someone who gets off on hurting kids who can't fight back. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures, forcing myself to document every bruise, every mark, every piece of evidence that would nail these bastards to the wall. My hands were steady. Military training kicks in when you need it most. But inside, I was coming apart like a cheap suit in a thunderstorm. Aisha handed me a manila envelope that felt heavier than it should have. Inside were sealed evidence bags containing Lily's clothes, a pink shirt with unicorns on it, and little denim leggings that were still damp in places that made my stomach lurch. But the real treasure was the USB drive she slipped me along with the clothes. I recorded my phone call with Detective Carl Mercer, she said, keeping her voice low like we were discussing state secrets. You need to hear this. I plugged the drive into my phone and hit play, and what I heard made me want to put my fist through the nearest wall. Detective Mercer's voice came through the tiny speaker's sounding board, like he was discussing the weather or what to have for lunch. Look, lady, kids fall down all the time. You hospital people get paranoid about every bump and scrape. Drop it. Drop it. 2 words that basically translated to, we don't give a damn about your daughter because it's inconvenient for us to care. 2 words that told me everything I needed to know about the quality of law enforcement in this particular corner of America. That's when Julia decided to make her grand entrance, walking into the room like she owned the place. She still had that same perfume, something expensive that probably cost more than most people make in a week, and that same cold smile that used to make me think she was mysterious instead of just empty inside. Now she looked like what she'd always been, a woman who'd trade her own kids' safety for social convenience. We should talk before you do anything stupid, she said, and her tone had that condescending edge that used to make me want to sleep on the couch rather than deal with another argument about money or priorities or why I cared more about other people's kids overseas than my own family. No, I said, and the word came out harder than I intended. I'll talk after I make 3 phone calls. One to a lawyer who specializes in federal civil rights violations, one to a journalist who's been dying to write a story about the Mercer family, and one to the military liaison who doesn't answer to your brother-in-law or anybody else in this joke of a police department. Her smile cracked like ice on a warm day. For the first time since I'd known her, Julia looked genuinely worried. See, the thing about people who play games with other people's lives is they get comfortable thinking everyone else is playing by the same rules. They think marriage is about keeping secrets and family is about maintaining appearances and justice is something you can buy with the right connections. But I wasn't the same guy she divorced while I was deployed, the one who used to bend over backwards trying to keep the peace. That guy died somewhere between the phone call in Iraq and the plane ride home. The guy standing in this hospital room had spent years learning how to dismantle networks of people who thought they were untouchable. You don't know who you're messing with, she said, but her voice had lost that confident edge. Now she sounded like what she was, scared. Actually, I said, watching her face change as the implications started sinking in, I think you're the one who doesn't know who you're messing with anymore. See, the guy you married and divorced was trying to save the world one village at a time. The guy you're talking to now is just trying to save his daughter, and that makes me a lot more dangerous than you remember. She turned and walked out without another word, leaving behind nothing but that expensive perfume and the smell of fear. The room felt cleaner without her in it, like someone had opened a window and let the poison air escape. Aisha was watching me with those sharp eyes, probably trying to figure out if I was going to be part of the solution or part of the problem. What happens now? She asked. I looked at my daughter, sleeping in that hospital bed with machines monitoring her breathing, and made a promise that I intended to keep. Now we make some phone calls, I said. And then we watch these bastards learn the difference between local politics and federal justice. Dawn came up over the city like God was having second thoughts about the whole sunrise thing, all gray and reluctant, like it didn't want to shed light on whatever ugliness was about to unfold. I was sitting in Mel's diner on 5th Street at 0530 hours, nursing coffee that could strip paint and watching the door for Rafael Ortiz. Mel's was one of those places that looked like it had been decorated by someone's grandmother in 1987 and nobody had bothered to update it since. Cracked vinyl booths, fluorescent lights that hummed like angry wasps, and a smell that was part bacon grease, part industrial cleaner, and part broken dreams. Rafael walked in at exactly 0535, and the first thing I noticed was that he looked like he hadn't slept in about 3 days. His hair was doing that thing where it can't decide which direction it wants to grow. His shirt looked like he'd grabbed it off the floor, and he had that slightly manic gleam in his eyes that investigative journalists get when they smell blood in the water. He slid into the booth across from me carrying a leather messenger bag that looked older than both of us combined. You know, he said, pulling out a flash drive that was smaller than my thumb. I've been sitting on this story for 8 years, waiting for someone with the balls and the standing to crack it wide open. Turns out all I needed was a pissed-off dad with federal connections and a security clearance. The flash drive looked innocent enough, Just a piece of plastic and circuitry that probably cost about $5 at Best Buy. But when Raphael plugged it into his laptop and started clicking through files, I realized I was looking at enough evidence to bury the Mercer family so deep they'd need archaeological equipment to find them. We're talking about sealed complaints that mysteriously disappeared from the system, hospital logs that showed a pattern of suspicious injuries getting written off as accidents, and police reports that had been redacted so heavily they looked like government UFO documents. Holy shit, I said, scrolling through page after page of what looked like a systematic cover-up spanning nearly a decade. How the hell did you get all this? Raphael grinned like a shark who'd just spotted a wounded swimmer. You'd be amazed how many nurses, social workers, and beat cops have been keeping their own copies of reports, just in case someone ever came along who could actually do something with them. Turns out half the department knows the Mercer brothers are dirty. They just needed someone with enough juice to make it stick. One file in particular caught my attention. A case from 3 years ago involving a 6-year-old girl who'd been brought to St. Gabriel's with injuries that the attending physician had described as consistent with systematic abuse. The detective assigned to the case? Carl Mercer. The final disposition? Case closed due to insufficient evidence, despite the fact that the medical examiner's report was more damning than a DNA test at a paternity hearing. You are the missing piece, Raphael said, tapping the screen with a finger that had ink stains under the nail. You're the father with military standing, federal connections, and a daughter who was victimized by the same system that's been protecting these clowns for years. You can tear the lid off this thing in a way that nobody else could. From Mel's, I drove straight to a federal annex building downtown that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought intimidating bureaucracy was an architectural style. All concrete and glass and security checkpoints that made you feel like you were entering a minimum security prison. But inside that building was Colonel Miriam Stone, and when I walked into her temporary office, I felt like I was back in the Army for the first time since my discharge. Miriam looked exactly like what Central Casting would order if they needed someone to play a retired military officer who could still kick ass and take names. Gray hair pulled back in a regulation bun. Uniform that looked like it had been pressed with a steam iron and a prayer, and eyes that could see through bullshit from about 3 counties away. She was sitting across from Special Agent Dana Cho, who had the kind of quiet intensity that made you think she probably spent her weekends reading case files for fun. Agent Cho is with the Federal Task Force on Crimes Against Children, Miriam said without bothering with small talk. She specializes in cases involving law enforcement obstruction and official misconduct. I thought you two should meet. Agent Cho looked like she could have been anyone's suburban mom. Medium height, brown hair, the kind of face that would blend into a crowd at a soccer game. But when she started talking about child exploitation cases and corruption patterns, her voice had this surgical precision that made me think she probably knew more about the dark side of human nature than most people learn in a lifetime. I've reviewed the preliminary materials your journalist friend provided, she said, opening a manila folder that was thicker than a phone book. What you've stumbled onto here isn't just a case of local corruption. It's a systematic pattern of official misconduct that falls under federal jurisdiction. Civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to deny due process. We're talking about RICO predicate offenses. I handed over everything I had. The photos of Lily's injuries, the sealed evidence bags with her clothes, the audio recording of Detective Mercer telling Nurse Aisha to drop it, and my sworn statement detailing everything that had happened from the phone call in Iraq to the confrontation with Julia in the hospital room. Agent Cho listened like she was taking inventory of a crime scene, asking sharp questions that cut right to the heart of what mattered. This is bigger than one man hurting one child, she said finally, closing the folder with a sound like a coffin lid slamming shut. What you've given us is the spine of a federal case that's going to bring down a network of corruption that's been operating with impunity for years. You just gave us the missing witness with the standing to make it all stick. She opened a drawer in the conference table and pulled out a digital recorder that looked like it belonged in a spy movie. We move now, she said, hitting the record button. Before they have time to destroy evidence or coordinate their stories or disappear into the bureaucratic maze they've been hiding behind. The recorder's red light started blinking, and I realized we'd just crossed the point of no return. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. And justice, as it turns out, has its own timeline that doesn't give a damn about anyone's convenience or connections or family ties. State your name for the record, Agent Cho said, and I smiled for the first time since that phone call in Iraq. Time to burn it all down. You know what's beautiful about federal coordination? It's like watching a Swiss watch made of badges and warrants. Every piece moving in perfect synchronization, every timing calculated down to the second. By late afternoon, Agent Cho had assembled what looked like the cast of a really expensive action movie. CID investigators who specialized in military-connected cases, HHSOIG agents who knew how to follow money trails through bureaucratic mazes, federal marshals who looked like they bench-pressed small cars for fun, and military police who understood that sometimes justice requires a little extra muscle. The coordination meeting happened in a conference room that smelled like bad coffee and good intentions. Agent Cho stood at the head of a table covered with maps, photographs, and arrest warrants that had more signatures on them than a high school yearbook. She moved through the operational plan like a conductor leading an orchestra, making sure every agency knew their part in what was about to become the Mercer family's worst Tuesday morning in recorded history. We do not go to the local station, she emphasized, tapping the map with a laser pointer that probably cost more than my monthly combat pay. These people own that building. They own those walls. They own every desk and filing cabinet and coffee machine. We go around them, over them, and through them, but we do not give them home field advantage. The plan was elegantly simple, which is usually the sign of someone who knows what they're doing. 2 simultaneous operations, Brent O'Malley's suburban castle and Chief Alan Mercer's McMansion on the other side of town. No phone calls, no warnings, no courtesy notifications to give these clowns time to lawyer up or coordinate their stories. Just a dark tide of federal authority rolling up to their front doors at exactly 0607 hours, because apparently Agent Cho believed in the psychological impact of getting people out of bed before their brains were fully operational. I spent the night in a hotel room that looked like it had been decorated by someone who thought generic business traveler was a legitimate design philosophy. Beige walls, beige carpet, beige bedspread that probably came with a certificate of mediocrity. But I wasn't there to critique interior design. I was there to stare at the ceiling and think about Lily sleeping in that hospital bed, hooked up to machines that beeped like electronic lullabies counting down the hours until justice finally showed up to the party. Sleep was pretty much a non-starter. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those finger-shaped bruises around Lily's wrist, heard Detective Mercer's bored voice telling a nurse to drop it, smelled Julia's expensive perfume mixed with the antiseptic air of a children's hospital. So I did what soldiers do when sleep won't come. I cleaned my gear, checked my phone for updates, and mentally rehearsed everything that could go wrong with tomorrow's operation. At 0530, I was dressed and caffeinated and sitting in the parking lot of a Dunkin' Donuts that looked like it was staffed entirely by people who'd given up on life before their second cup of coffee. Agent Cho pulled up in a black SUV that screamed federal government, so loudly it might as well have had sirens and flashing lights. She was wearing tactical gear that looked like it had been personally fitted by someone who understood that looking professional while kicking down doors was an art form. "Ready?" she asked, and I nodded because what else do you say when someone's about to serve justice on a silver platter with a side of handcuffs? The drive to Brent's neighborhood was like traveling through the American dream as marketed by a realtor with a cocaine habit. Perfect lawns, perfect driveways, perfect mailboxes lined up like soldiers in suburbia's army of conformity. The kind of place where domestic violence hides behind manicured hedges and child abuse gets covered up by homeowners association fees. Brent O'Malley lived on Maple Street, because of course he did. His house was one of those cookie-cutter colonials that looked like it had been ordered from a catalog called Generic White Guy Success. 2-car garage, circular driveway, security system stickers on the windows that probably cost more than most people's cars. The kind of place that screamed, "I've got nothing to hide," so loudly that you knew the owner definitely had something to hide. At exactly 0607, the federal cavalry arrived like the wrath of God with better legal documentation. No sirens, no flashing lights, no dramatic Hollywood nonsense. Just a convoy of dark vehicles that rolled onto Maple Street like they owned the place. Which, legally speaking, they kind of did. I watched from Agent Cho's SUV as two plainclothes agents approached the front door while uniformed officers took positions at the corners of the house. These weren't local cops who might have drinking buddies in common with the target. These were federal professionals who understood that corruption investigations require people who can't be bought, intimidated, or sweet-talked into looking the other way. The door opened, and Brent O'Malley stepped out looking like a man who'd just realized his luck had finally run out. He tried the usual suburban white guy bluster. "What's this about? Do you know who I'm married to?" "I'm calling my lawyer," but it died pretty fast when they showed him the warrant and started reading him his rights. Inside the house, the search team moved like they'd done this dance 100 times before. They found Brent's phone, which probably contained enough text messages to incriminate half the city government. They found a small leather bag hidden in the bedroom closet that matched Lily's description of the special bag her stepfather used when he wanted to teach lessons. They found bank records that showed payments to Detective Carl Mercer going back 3 years. But the real prize was Brent himself, standing in his driveway in handcuffs, finally understanding that his connection to the police chief wasn't going to save him from federal charges that carried sentences measured in decades rather than months. Across town, a second team was serving Chief Alan Mercer with his own wake-up call. The chief came out of his house in a t-shirt and bare feet, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth, finally getting a taste of what it felt like to be on the wrong end of a badge. By 0800, both men were in federal custody, and Agent Cho was fielding phone calls from defense attorneys who suddenly realized their usual tricks weren't going to work against prosecutors who didn't care about local politics or family connections or who knew whom at the country club. I stood in Brent's driveway, watching the neighbors peek through their curtains like they were witnessing the apocalypse, and felt something I hadn't felt since that phone call in Iraq: hope. Not the warm, fuzzy kind of hope you get from greeting cards, but the cold, hard kind that comes from watching bullies finally meet someone bigger than they are. The system that had failed my daughter was about to learn what federal jurisdiction really meant. You know what's faster than gossip in a small town? Federal arrests hitting social media when half the city government gets perp-walked before breakfast. By 0900, my phone was blowing up like a Taliban ammunition depot, buzzing and chirping with calls from numbers I recognized, numbers I didn't, and numbers that probably belonged to reporters who'd sold their souls for a good story and were now smelling Pulitzer Prize potential in the morning air. The news broke on Channel 7 first, probably because Raphael had friends in all the right places and understood the value of timing. Police chief arrested in federal child abuse cover-up probe. The headline crawled across the bottom of every screen in the city like a virus spreading through the local power structure's worst nightmare. By mid-morning, it wasn't just local news. CNN picked it up, then Fox, then every blogger and podcaster who'd ever complained about police corruption had something to say about the Mercer family's spectacular fall from grace. I was holed up in my rental car outside St. Gabriel's Hospital, watching the media circus set up camp on the front lawn like they were preparing for a siege. News vans with satellite dishes, reporters checking their hair and phone cameras, photographers with lenses long enough to spot corruption from orbit. The whole scene looked like democracy having a messy public breakdown, which, when you think about it, was pretty much exactly what was happening. My phone rang for the 20th time in an hour, and I let it go to voicemail along with all the others. Reporters wanting quotes, old army buddies who'd seen my name in the news, distant relatives suddenly remembering they had my number. Even got a call from some producer in Hollywood who wanted to know if I'd sold the movie rights yet. Because apparently nothing says American justice like turning your kids' trauma into entertainment for people who eat popcorn in the dark. At 0912, Julia showed up at my temporary command post, which was basically a rented Honda Civic in the hospital parking lot. She brought Detective Carl Mercer with her, and the two of them looked like they were heading to a funeral, which, considering what had happened to their little protection racket, they basically were. Julia was wearing her serious conversation face, the one she used to put on when she wanted to discuss money or why I spent too much time overseas or whether we should refinance the house. Carl looked like someone had told him Santa Claus was actually a federal prosecutor. They walked up to my car like they owned the place, which was pretty ballsy considering one of them was married to a guy who was currently enjoying federal hospitality, and the other one was probably going to join him before lunch. Julia tapped on my window with fingernails that probably cost more than most people's grocery budget, wearing that smile that used to make me think she was being mysterious instead of manipulative. I rolled the window down exactly 2 inches, enough to hear whatever bullshit they were selling, not enough to make it feel like a friendly conversation. "We need to talk," Julia said, using that tone that suggested this was somehow my fault. "Before you make this situation worse for everyone, including Lily." "Interesting theory," I said, keeping my voice flat as a runway. "Here's mine. You and Detective Dumbass there need to get away from my car before I call Agent Cho and let her know you're attempting to intimidate a federal witness." Carl stepped forward, probably forgetting that his badge didn't carry much weight when his boss was wearing handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit. "Look, we can work this out. Family business should stay family business. Nobody needs to get hurt here." I looked at him through that 2-inch gap in the window and wondered if he'd practiced that speech in the mirror or if stupidity just came naturally to him. "Detective Mercer," I said, "your brother is in federal custody. Your brother-in-law is looking at 20 years in prison, and you're standing in a hospital parking lot trying to intimidate the father of an abuse victim. If you think this situation can get any worse for you, I'm happy to prove you wrong." Julia's mask slipped for just a second, and I saw something I'd never seen before: genuine fear. Not the social anxiety she used to get when she thought people were judging her outfit or her car or her choice in husbands. This was the kind of fear that comes when you realize the game is over and you're standing on the wrong side of history with your ass hanging out in the wind. But instead of backing down, she doubled down, because people like Julia would rather burn the whole world down than admit they were wrong. "You think you're some kind of hero?" she hissed through that window gap. "You destroyed a family. You destroyed careers. You destroyed lives." "No," I said, and my voice came out colder than I intended. "I protected my daughter. The rest of you destroyed yourselves." That's when Colonel Miriam Stone pulled up in a government sedan that looked like it had been designed by people who understood that intimidation was a form of communication. She got out wearing her dress uniform and the kind of expression that made junior officers check their shoelaces and senior officers remember urgent appointments somewhere else. Julia and Carl took one look at 6 feet of retired military officer walking toward them like justice in a pressed uniform and suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to be. They scurried back to their car faster than cockroaches when someone turns on the kitchen lights. Colonel Stone watched them drive away, then walked over to my window with a manila envelope thick enough to choke a horse. "Assistant District Attorney Sophia Park is expecting you," she said. "She's got bank transfers, text messages, and a timeline that puts your ex-wife and her husband exactly where your daughter said they were when the abuse happened." Meanwhile, across town, Major Rhodes and Agent Cho were holding a joint press briefing that was getting more coverage than a presidential election. They didn't mention my name. Federal investigations protect witnesses, unlike local police departments that leak information like sieves. But they made it clear that this case mattered, that children's voices would be heard, and that nobody was above the law. The reporters asked the usual questions about jurisdiction and evidence, and whether there would be more arrests. Agent Cho answered with the kind of professional precision that made it clear she'd done this dance before. But when some jackass from the back row asked whether this was just federal overreach targeting local law enforcement, her expression went Arctic. This investigation began when a nurse called to report suspected child abuse and a detective told her to drop it, she said. "If that's what you consider legitimate law enforcement, then we have very different definitions of the word legitimate." By noon, the story had legs and was running marathons across every news platform in America. The Mercer family's protection racket was front-page news, and suddenly everyone who'd ever been told to drop it by local police was finding their voice. My phone buzzed with a text from Raphael. "Check your email. We're just getting started." I smiled for the first time all day. Sometimes justice needs a little help going viral. You know what's funny about courtrooms? They're designed to look like justice actually lives there. All that polished wood and fancy carpet and marble that probably cost more than most people's houses. Like someone figured if you made the room impressive enough, truth would feel obligated to show up for the party. The federal courthouse downtown had all the bells and whistles. High ceilings that made every whisper echo like a confession. Windows that let in just enough light to make everyone look either angelic or guilty, depending on where they sat. And that particular smell that courtrooms have. Part furniture polish, part fear, part the lingering ghosts of every lie that had ever been told under oath. 2 days after the arrests, the place was packed tighter than a subway car during rush hour. The Mercers' friends from City Hall had claimed the back benches like they were at a high school football game, all of them wearing their "this is a terrible misunderstanding" faces while secretly calculating how much distance they needed to put between themselves and the sinking ship. You could practically hear the sound of loyalty evaporating in real time. I was sitting in the third row, right behind Assistant District Attorney Sophia Park, who looked like she'd been born to stand in front of juries and explain why bad people deserved bad things to happen to them. Sophia had this way of organizing evidence that reminded me of watching a Master Sergeant field strip a rifle. Every piece had its place, every movement was efficient, and when she was done, you had something that could definitely do some damage. Judge Althea Monroe took the bench at exactly 0900, and let me tell you something about Judge Monroe. She had the kind of presence that made everyone in the room sit up straighter and remember their manners. 20 years on the federal bench, 15 years before that as a prosecutor who specialized in cases involving children, and a reputation for being tougher than overcooked steak when it came to people who hurt kids. If you were a defendant in her courtroom, you'd better come correct or go home disappointed. Ada Park stood up and started laying out the case like she was building a house. Foundation first, then walls, then a roof that would keep all the evidence nice and dry. She began with Nurse Aisha's photographs, blown up on a screen that made those finger-shaped bruises around Lily's wrist look like they'd been painted with purple ink. The courtroom went dead quiet, the kind of silence that happens when people realize they're looking at something that's going to give them nightmares. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Park said, her voice carrying across the courtroom like it owned the place. This case began when a pediatric nurse saw injuries that didn't match the story she was told. It continued when she called the police and was told to drop it. And it ends today, with you deciding whether a badge gives someone the right to ignore a child's pain. She moved through the evidence like a conductor leading an orchestra, each piece building on the last. The sealed evidence bags containing Lily's clothes, still tagged and photographed according to chain of custody procedures that would make a forensics textbook proud. My sworn statement, delivered via video link because apparently my security clearance made me too valuable to risk in an open courtroom. The audio recording of Detective Carl Mercer telling Nurse Aisha to drop it when she called about a suspected child abuse case. But the real showstopper was Raphael's work. 8 years of investigative journalism condensed into a timeline that looked like a roadmap to hell. Hospital admissions that had been mysteriously misfiled, police reports that had been buried deeper than Jimmy Hoffa, complaints that had disappeared into the bureaucratic equivalent of a black hole. Every case had the same pattern: suspicious injuries, concerned medical professionals, and Detective Carl Mercer making sure nothing ever went anywhere. The courtroom erupted in gasps and muttered conversations when Park displayed the bank records showing payments from Brent O'Malley to Detective Mercer going back 3 years. Not huge amounts, a few hundred here, a few hundred there, but consistent enough to establish a pattern that any jury member with half a brain could recognize as what it was. Payments for services rendered. Then came the text messages, and that's when things got really ugly. Ada Park read them out loud in that clear, professional voice that made every word sound like a nail being hammered into a coffin. From Brent O'Malley to Julia O'Malley, 2 days before Lily was hospitalized. Kid needs to learn some respect. Time for a lesson. From Julia O'Malley to Brent O'Malley, the same day. Just don't leave marks where people can see them. From Brent O'Malley to Detective Carl Mercer, the day Lily was admitted to the hospital. We have a situation. Need it handled quietly. From Detective Carl Mercer to Brent O'Malley, 2 hours later. Consider it handled. Kids fall all the time. But the message that really drove the nail home was Julia's response when Brent texted her about the hospital asking too many questions. She'll survive. Maybe she'll learn to stay in her place. The silence in that courtroom was so thick you could have cut it with a knife and served it for dinner. I watched the jury members' faces as they processed what they'd just heard. 12 ordinary people realizing they were looking at the kind of evil that hides behind suburban respectability and family connections. Judge Monroe's expression went from judicial neutrality to something that looked like she was calculating how many years of prison time would be sufficient to balance the scales of justice. Her pen had stopped moving across her notepad, and she was staring at the defendant's table like she was trying to figure out what species of human could write those messages about a child. When Ada Park displayed the photographs of Lily's injuries alongside the text messages, the impact was devastating. You could literally watch the defendant's lawyers realizing that their usual bag of tricks, character witnesses, procedural challenges, reasonable doubt arguments, weren't going to work against evidence that damning. Brent O'Malley sat at the defendant's table looking like someone had explained to him that karma was real and it had his home address. His expensive lawyer kept shuffling papers like he was looking for a miracle hidden somewhere in the legal briefs. Detective Carl Mercer stared at his hands, probably wondering how 20 years of being a cop had led to sitting in federal court wearing handcuffs and shame. But Julia was the most interesting to watch. She kept trying to catch my eye, wearing that same manipulative smile she used to use when she wanted me to forget about whatever she'd done wrong this time. Like she thought she could charm her way out of federal charges the same way she used to charm her way out of taking responsibility for anything. Ada Park saved the best for last. A recorded statement from Lily, taken by a child psychologist in a setting designed to make kids feel safe. The jury listened to my 8-year-old daughter describe, in her own words, what her stepfather had done to her and how her mother had told her to keep it, their special secret. When the recording ended, Judge Monroe called for a 15-minute recess, and I watched 12 jurors file out looking like they'd just witnessed a car accident. The Mercer supporters in the back rows suddenly found the exit doors very interesting. Justice, it turned out, looked a lot brighter when you turned up all the lights. You know what's beautiful about watching a house of cards fall down? It doesn't happen all at once. First one card wobbles, then another starts to lean, and before you know it, the whole structure is collapsing faster than a politician's promises during election season. The Mercer family protection racket started coming apart the minute Brent O'Malley realized that federal prosecutors don't give a damn about local politics or family connections or how much money you donate to the Police Benevolent Association. It was day 3 of the trial, and Brent's lawyer, some overpriced suit from a downtown firm that probably charged more per hour than most people make in a month, was having what you might politely call a nervous breakdown. He kept shuffling through papers like he was looking for a get-out-of-jail-free card that definitely wasn't there, sweating through a shirt that probably cost more than my car payment, and shooting desperate looks at the jury like he was hoping one of them might suddenly develop selective blindness. That's when Brent decided to cut his losses and throw everyone else under the bus so hard they'd need tire tracks as evidence. His lawyer stood up and announced that his client wanted to cooperate with the prosecution, which is legal speak for, "We're totally screwed, and we're willing to screw everyone else if it means we might get to see daylight again before we're collecting Social Security." The plea hearing was like watching a grown man wet himself in public, except instead of embarrassment, it was federal charges, and instead of a change of clothes, it was a plea agreement that would keep him from spending the rest of his life in a concrete box. Brent sat at that defendant's table looking like someone had explained to him that karma was real and it had been taking notes. "Your Honor," Brent's lawyer said, his voice shaking like he'd been mainlining espresso and anxiety. "My client wishes to accept responsibility for his actions and cooperate fully with the government's ongoing investigation into official corruption and obstruction of justice." Judge Monroe looked at Brent like she was trying to decide whether he deserved a life sentence or just a really long one. "Mr. O'Malley," she said, her voice colder than a Minnesota winter, "do you understand that by pleading guilty, you're admitting to systematically abusing a child and then conspiring with law enforcement officers to cover up your crimes?" Brent nodded like a bobblehead with a nervous condition. "Yes, Your Honor. I also understand that my cooperation agreement requires me to provide complete and truthful testimony about the role played by Julia O'Malley, Detective Carl Mercer, and Chief Alan Mercer in obstructing this investigation." And just like that, the floodgates opened. Brent started spilling secrets like a drunk girl at a slumber party, except instead of gossip about who kissed whom behind the gymnasium, it was detailed testimony about how the Mercer brothers had been running interference for abusers for years. He told the court about cash payments, about phone calls telling him not to worry because Carl has it handled, about Julia coaching him on what to say if anyone asked questions about Lily's injuries. The best part, and by best, I mean the part that made me want to reach across that courtroom and shake his hand before punching him in the face, was when he described how the system worked. Concerned citizens would call the police about suspicious injuries or strange behavior from kids in the neighborhood. Detective Carl Mercer would take the calls, file reports that looked official, and then make sure those reports disappeared into the bureaucratic equivalent of a black hole. Meanwhile, Chief Alan Mercer would handle any federal inquiries by claiming jurisdiction and promising thorough investigations that never actually happened. It was a beautiful system, really, if you were the kind of sociopath who thought protecting child abusers was a legitimate use of taxpayer money and law enforcement authority. Detective Carl Mercer folded next, because apparently watching your co-conspirator throw you under the bus will make you reconsider your loyalty to the cause. His plea hearing was even more pathetic than Brent's, mostly because he spent the whole time trying to convince Judge Monroe that he was really a good cop who'd just made some bad decisions. Which is like saying Jeffrey Dahmer was really a good neighbor who just had some unusual dietary preferences. Your Honor, Detective Mercer said, his voice cracking like a 13-year-old boy asking someone to prom. I want to take responsibility for my actions and make amends for the harm I've caused to the community and to the children I swore to protect. Judge Monroe looked at him like she was calculating how much bullshit she was willing to tolerate in her courtroom on any given Tuesday. Detective Mercer, she said, you took an oath to serve and protect the citizens of this community. Instead, you used your badge and your authority to protect child abusers from the consequences of their actions. What exactly do you think making amends looks like in a situation like this? Carl Mercer didn't have an answer for that one. Probably because there isn't a good answer when you've spent years telling hospital workers to drop child abuse cases because they were inconvenient for your family's political ambitions. But the real show was Chief Alan Mercer, who tried to maintain his dignity right up until Internal Affairs played a recording of him coaching another officer on how to route reports to archive status without actually investigating them. The recording was from 2 years ago, captured during what the chief thought was a private conversation in his office about how to handle sensitive cases involving prominent community members. Look, Chief Mercer's voice came through the courtroom speakers like the voice of corruption itself. Sometimes you gotta understand that being a good cop means knowing which cases deserve your full attention and which ones are better left alone. We're not social workers, we're law enforcement officers, and our job is to maintain order in the community. The other voice on the recording, later identified as Detective Mike Harrison, who'd been wearing a wire for the FBI for 6 months, asked what happened when cases involved actual crimes against children. Kids are resilient, the chief's voice replied. They bounce back. But careers and reputations? Those are harder to rebuild. You gotta think about the big picture. When that recording finished playing, you could hear a pin drop in that courtroom. Judge Monroe looked like she was personally offended that someone had wasted her time with a human being that morally bankrupt. The jury looked like they'd just watched someone kick a puppy while burning an American flag. Chief Mercer's lawyer made a valiant effort to claim the recording was taken out of context, but it's pretty hard to provide context that makes "kids are resilient" sound reasonable when you're talking about ignoring child abuse cases. The final piece of the puzzle was Priya Desai's testimony about Lily's trauma responses and recovery. Priya took the stand wearing her professional social worker face and explained, in terms that even the dumbest jury member could understand, exactly what systematic abuse does to a child's developing brain and why the injuries Lily sustained were absolutely not consistent with accidental falls. Children who suffer abuse at the hands of trusted adults develop complex trauma responses, Priya explained, her voice steady as a surgeon's hands. They learn to minimize their pain, to accept responsibility for their abuse, and to believe that asking for help will only make things worse. When the adults who are supposed to protect them, parents, step-parents, police officers, instead conspire to silence them, the psychological damage can be devastating and long-lasting. She also testified about why Nurse Aisha's actions were so crucial. When medical professionals recognize abuse and take appropriate action to document and report it, they send a powerful message to the child. Your pain matters, your safety matters, and there are adults in the world who will fight for you. Judge Monroe nodded along like Priya was explaining basic mathematics to kindergartners. When the defense tried to cross-examine her, Priya delivered responses that were so professional and devastating that the lawyers basically gave up and sat down. By the end of the day, The entire conspiracy had collapsed like a house built on quicksand. 3 guilty pleas, 1 cooperation agreement, and enough evidence to bury the whole Mercer organization so deep they'd need archaeological equipment to find it. Justice was starting to look pretty good in federal court. You know what's funny about justice? It doesn't sound like trumpets or feel like a Hollywood moment when it finally shows up. It sounds like a gavel hitting wood and feels like exhaling air you didn't realize you'd been holding for months. Sentencing day came faster than anyone expected, probably because Judge Monroe had seen enough evidence to convict half the city government and wasn't in the mood to let this circus drag on any longer than necessary. The federal courthouse was packed again, but this time the energy was different. Instead of the nervous anticipation of a trial, there was this sense of inevitability hanging in the air like smoke from a house fire that was finally burning itself out. The Mercers' friends from City Hall were notably absent. Nothing kills political loyalty faster than federal convictions and the prospect of guilt by association. The back rows were filled with reporters, victim advocates, and people who'd been waiting years to see the Mercer protection racket get what was coming to it. I was sitting in the same third-row seat I'd occupied during the trial, wearing my dress uniform because sometimes you need to look like justice when justice is being served. Colonel Stone was beside me, also in uniform, representing the military's interest in seeing one of their own get a fair shake from the civilian justice system. Behind us sat Rafael Ortiz, probably calculating which journalism awards he was going to win for his coverage of the case, and Priya Desai, who looked like she was personally invested in seeing every child abuser in the city get what they deserved. Judge Monroe took the bench at exactly 0900, and the first thing you noticed was her expression, the kind of cold professionalism that judges get when they're about to hand down sentences that will ruin lives. She'd spent 3 weeks listening to evidence about systematic child abuse and official corruption, and you could tell from her body language that she was done being polite about it. The defendants will rise, she said, and watching 4 adults stand up to hear their fates was like watching dominoes line up for the last time before they all fell down. Brent O'Malley was first, because apparently the court system believes in starting with the person who actually put his hands on my daughter, his lawyer. The same overpriced suit who'd been sweating through his shirts for the past month stood beside him looking like he was attending his own funeral. Brent had lost about 20 pounds since his arrest, and his expensive haircut couldn't hide the fact that federal custody doesn't come with a personal stylist. Mr. O'Malley, Judge Monroe said, consulting her notes like she was reading a grocery list instead of destroying a man's life. You have pleaded guilty to multiple counts of felony child abuse, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and witness tampering. The court has reviewed your cooperation agreement with the government, your statements of remorse, and the letters of support from your former employers and community members. She paused, and I swear you could hear everyone in the courtroom holding their breath. However, she continued, and that word hung in the air like a sword waiting to drop. This court must also consider the systematic nature of your abuse, the vulnerability of your victim, and the fact that you used your relationship with law enforcement to ensure that your crimes would go unpunished. The pre-sentence investigation reveals a pattern of escalating violence that might have continued indefinitely without the intervention of federal authorities. The sentence came down like a hammer: 15 years federal prison, 5 years supervised release, mandatory registration as a sex offender, and a permanent restraining order preventing any contact with Lily until she reached the age of 18. The courtroom erupted in whispers and scattered applause that Judge Monroe quickly gavelled to silence. Brent's legs gave out, and his lawyer had to hold him up while the marshals prepared to escort him back to his cell. He tried to turn around and look at me, probably hoping for some sign of forgiveness or mercy, but I was busy studying my fingernails and thinking about how 15 years wasn't nearly long enough. Detective Carl Mercer was next, and watching a 20-year veteran of law enforcement get sentenced for corruption was like watching a masterclass in how not to be a cop. Carl had tried to clean himself up for sentencing. Fresh haircut, pressed uniform. The whole, I'm really sorry, and I've learned my lesson performance that defense lawyers probably teach in Bullshit 101. Detective Mercer, Judge Monroe said, and her voice had taken on this tone that suggested she was personally offended by having to sentence a police officer. You took an oath to serve and protect the citizens of this community. Instead, You used your badge and your authority to facilitate child abuse and obstruct justice. The evidence shows that you received payments totaling over $8,000 in exchange for making child abuse investigations disappear. The sentence was brutal: 12 years federal prison, 3 years supervised release, forfeiture of all pension benefits, and a permanent ban from any law enforcement employment. Carl's wife started crying in the gallery, but Judge Monroe wasn't in the mood for sympathy. The court notes that your actions didn't just harm individual children, she continued. You undermined public trust in law enforcement and betrayed every honest police officer who risks their life to protect the innocent. That betrayal of public trust is an aggravating factor that this court cannot ignore. Carl's lawyer tried to argue for leniency based on his client's years of public service, but Judge Monroe shut that down faster than a bouncer at closing time. 20 years of law enforcement experience makes Detective Mercer's crimes worse, not better, she said. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew it was wrong, and he did it anyway because he thought his badge would protect him from the consequences. But the real show was Chief Alan Mercer, who'd maintained his arrogant attitude right up until the moment he realized that federal judges don't care about local politics or family connections or how many charity golf tournaments you've sponsored. The chief walked to the defendant's table like he was heading to his own execution, which, metaphorically speaking, he pretty much was. Chief Mercer, Judge Monroe said, and now her voice had taken on the tone of someone who was about to make an example out of somebody. You held the highest law enforcement position in this city. You were entrusted with protecting the most vulnerable members of our community. Instead, you turned the police department into a criminal enterprise designed to protect child abusers from prosecution. The evidence against the chief was overwhelming. Recorded conversations about hiding evidence, bank records showing payments to offshore accounts, and testimony from half a dozen officers who'd been ordered to make cases disappear. The RICO enhancements meant he was looking at federal conspiracy charges that carried sentences measured in decades, not years. The court finds that you operated a pattern and practice of corruption that meets the federal definition of racketeering, Judge Monroe continued. You used your position as chief of police to obstruct justice, intimidate witnesses, and facilitate the systematic abuse of children. This court has rarely encountered such a complete abandonment of public trust. The sentence was devastating: 25 years federal prison, 10 years supervised release, forfeiture of all assets connected to his criminal enterprise, and permanent disbarment from any public employment. The chief's face went white as paper, and for the first time since his arrest, he looked like he finally understood that his connections couldn't save him from federal consequences. But Julia was the one I'd been waiting to see get her comeuppance. She tried to dress for sympathy, wearing some conservative outfit that probably came from a "how to look innocent at your federal sentencing" catalog. Her lawyer had been arguing for months that she was really a victim too, manipulated by her abusive husband into participating in crimes she didn't understand. Judge Monroe wasn't buying it. "Mrs. O'Malley," she said, reading from notes that probably contained every text message Julia had ever sent about keeping Lily's abuse quiet. "The evidence shows that you were not a passive victim in this conspiracy. You actively participated in your daughter's abuse, coached your husband on how to avoid detection, and conspired with law enforcement to ensure that your crimes would go unpunished." The text messages were read aloud again, and hearing Julia's words about teaching Lily to stay in her place, echoing through that courtroom, was like listening to evil speak its own name. The judge had obviously spent considerable time reviewing the evidence, because she quoted specific messages that showed Julia wasn't just complicit. She was enthusiastic. "The court is particularly troubled by your statement that your daughter will survive, and maybe she'll learn," Judge Monroe continued. That level of callousness toward a child's suffering suggests a complete lack of maternal instinct and a fundamental inability to protect the child you brought into this world. Julia's sentence was 15 years federal prison, 5 years supervised release, and permanent termination of parental rights. She wouldn't see Lily again until my daughter was an adult, and even then, only if Lily chose to have contact with her. The courtroom was dead silent as the marshals prepared to escort Julia back to federal custody. She finally tried to look at me as they were putting the handcuffs on, probably hoping for some last-minute intervention or forgiveness, or maybe just acknowledgement that we'd once been married and shared a life together. But I was looking at Judge Monroe, who was explaining the appeals process and the conditions of federal supervised release, because Julia had stopped being my problem the minute she decided my daughter's pain was an acceptable price for her convenience. The whole sentencing hearing took less than 3 hours, but watching 4 people get a combined total of 67 years in federal prison was like watching justice work in fast forward. The Mercer family name, which had been a source of political power in this city for 2 generations, was now permanently associated with child abuse and corruption. The police department they'd controlled was being investigated by federal authorities who didn't care about local traditions or family legacies. Outside the courthouse, the media circus was waiting with their cameras and microphones and questions designed to get sound bites for the evening news. They wanted to know how I felt about the sentences, whether I thought justice had been served, what I planned to do next. I walked past them without saying a word, because this wasn't about making statements or getting my 15 minutes of fame. This was about my daughter sleeping safely in her hospital bed, knowing that the people who'd hurt her were never going to hurt her again. Colonel Stone caught up with me on the courthouse steps, and she had this expression that I'd seen before, the look that career military officers get when they've watched justice work the way it's supposed to work. "You didn't miss," she said, squeezing my shoulder once. For the first time since that phone call in Iraq, I finally felt like I could breathe. The war was over, and we'd won. You know what real quiet sounds like? It's not the absence of noise. That's just silence. And silence can be filled with all kinds of hidden tension and unspoken fears. Real quiet is when the dangerous noise stops, when the machines that were beeping warnings finally settle into steady rhythms, when your phone isn't buzzing with calls from reporters or lawyers or federal agents who need one more statement for their files. Real quiet is the sound of safety. And for the first time in months, that's what filled the house I'd rented 6 blocks from St. Gabriel's Hospital. It wasn't much to look at, a 3-bedroom ranch house that probably hadn't been updated since the Carter administration, with carpet that had seen better decades and kitchen appliances that looked like they'd been installed when disco was still a legitimate form of music. But it had something that mattered more than granite countertops or stainless steel refrigerators. It had a security system that would make Fort Knox jealous, deadbolts that could stop a determined rhinoceros, and most importantly, it was a place where Lily could sleep without wondering if someone was going to hurt her. The morning after sentencing, I was up at 0530 out of habit, making tea in a kitchen that smelled like fresh paint and new beginnings instead of hospital antiseptic and other people's bad decisions. The local newspaper was spread across the kitchen table, featuring a front-page story about the Mercer convictions that Raphael had written with the kind of satisfaction that investigative journalists get when they finally nail the story they've been chasing for years. The headline read, "Federal Sentences End Decades of Corruption," and the subhead was even better, "For Convicted in Child Abuse Cover-Up Conspiracy." But the best part was the editorial that ran alongside Raphael's story, written by someone who'd obviously been paying attention to what this case really meant. For too long, it read, "Our community allowed a culture of silence to protect the powerful at the expense of the powerless." The federal convictions handed down yesterday represent more than justice for one family. They represent a reckoning with a system that prioritized political convenience over children's safety. That's when I heard the sound that had become my new favorite noise in the world. Lily's feet shuffling down the hallway, moving at the speed of a kid who's just waking up and isn't entirely sure she wants to be awake yet. She appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing pajamas with unicorns on them, her hair sticking up in directions that defied physics, and cheeks that had finally started to look less gray and more like the healthy pink they used to be before the world tried to break her. "Morning, kiddo," I said, and she patted over to lean against me the way kids do when they need to recharge their batteries by absorbing some parental energy. She smelled like baby shampoo and clean sheets, and that particular scent that kids have when they've finally stopped being afraid all the time. "Dad," she said, her voice still scratchy from sleep, "you came fast." It was the same thing she'd said that first day in the hospital, and hearing it again hit me like a punch to the solar plexus. Because it wasn't just about the phone call in Iraq or the emergency flight home or the federal investigation that had turned her abusers into convicted felons. It was about every promise I'd ever made to her. Every time I told her that Daddy would always come when she needed him, Every moment when she'd wondered if the people who were supposed to protect her were actually going to show up when it mattered. "I will always come fast," I told her, and this time I knew it was true in a way it hadn't been before. Not because I'd proven it once, but because I'd learned the difference between being a dad who cared and being a dad who was willing to wage war against anyone who threatened his kid. She looked up at me with those serious eyes that 8-year-olds get when they're trying to process things that are too big for their brain to fully understand. "Are the bad people really gone?" she asked. Now, here's the thing about talking to kids who've been through trauma. You can't give them fairy tale answers, but you also can't dump the whole ugly truth on them like they're miniature adults who can handle the complete breakdown of how justice works. You have to find that sweet spot between honesty and hope, between protecting their innocence and giving them enough information to feel safe. "The bad people are in prison," I said, sitting down at the kitchen table so we could have this conversation at eye level. "Brent is going to be in prison for 15 years. Your mom is going to be in prison for 15 years. Detective Mercer is going to be in prison for 12 years. And Chief Mercer is going to be in prison for 25 years. Lily processed this information with the seriousness of a Supreme Court justice reviewing a constitutional amendment. "That's a really long time," she said. "It is," I agreed. "By the time any of them get out of prison, you'll be all grown up. You'll probably have a job and maybe kids of your own, and they'll be old people who can't hurt anyone anymore." But she had more questions, because kids always do when they're trying to make sense of a world that doesn't make sense. Why didn't anyone believe me before? This was the hard one, the question that went to the heart of everything that had gone wrong with the system that was supposed to protect her. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that adults sometimes care more about protecting their reputations than protecting children? How do you tell a kid that badges and uniforms and positions of authority don't automatically make someone trustworthy? "Some people did believe you," I said carefully. "Nurse Aisha believed you. That's why she took pictures and called me. Priya believed you. That's the lady who came to talk to you at the hospital. Agent Cho believed you. Colonel Stone believed you. Raphael believed you. All the good people believed you. But the police didn't believe me. The bad police didn't believe you because they were friends with Brent and your mom," I said. "They were more worried about protecting their friends than protecting you. But there are good police officers too. The federal agents who arrested the bad people were police officers. The difference is that the good police officers care more about protecting kids than protecting bad adults." Lily nodded like this made sense to her, which was a relief because I wasn't entirely sure I was explaining it right. Kids need the world to make sense, even when the world is demonstrably insane. "Will you have to go back to the war?" she asked, and this question hit me harder than all the others because it went to the heart of what this whole experience had taught me about priorities and choices and what it really means to serve and protect. "No," I said, and saying it out loud felt like making a promise to both of us. "I'm done with that war. My job now is taking care of you." The truth was more complicated, of course. I still had a few months left on my enlistment, but Colonel Stone had already started the paperwork for a compassionate discharge that would let me transition to civilian life without the usual bureaucratic nightmare. The Army understands that soldiers with kids who've been victimized need to be present for the recovery process, and they don't make you choose between serving your country and serving your family when your family needs you more. But there was another truth that I was still getting used to. I was done being the guy who tried to save the world one village at a time while my own kid was getting hurt in my absence. I was done with deployments and overseas assignments and missing Christmas mornings because some general thought my particular skill set was needed in whatever sandbox we were currently trying to democratize. My war was here now, and it was going to be fought in pediatric therapy appointments and school board meetings and every other battlefield where parents fight for their kids' future. That afternoon, I started making the calls I'd promised myself I would make, not to lawyers or federal agents or journalists, but to the people who'd made it possible for justice to actually work the way it was supposed to work. First call went to Nurse Aisha, who was back at St. Gabriel's doing what she'd always done, advocating for kids who couldn't advocate for themselves. When I thanked her for saving my daughter's life, she said something that I'm probably going to remember for the rest of my life. "Every child deserves to have someone who believes them. I'm just glad Lily had so many someones when it mattered." Second call went to Raphael, who was already working on a follow-up story about systematic reform in the city's police department and the federal oversight that was going to make sure the Mercer family's corruption racket stayed dead and buried. He told me that 3 other families had already come forward with similar stories, and the FBI was opening investigations into every case that Detective Carl Mercer had ever touched. Third call went to Priya, who'd become Lily's court-appointed advocate and was helping me navigate the world of pediatric trauma therapy and educational support services and all the other systems that exist to help kids recover from things that should never have happened to them in the first place. She told me that Lily was showing remarkable resilience for a child who'd been through systematic abuse, and that having a parent who was willing to fight for her was the most important factor in her recovery. Fourth call went to Agent Cho, who was still working cases involving official corruption and child exploitation, probably because she understood that the Mercer family was just one example of a problem that existed in communities all across America. She told me that the precedent set by Lily's case was already being used to investigate similar corruption in other jurisdictions, and that federal prosecutors were taking a much more aggressive approach to cases involving law enforcement obstruction of child abuse investigations. Fifth call went to Major Rhodes, who was processing my discharge paperwork and helping me transition from active duty to civilian life with all the benefits and support services that veterans are supposed to receive but don't always get. He told me that my service record would reflect the federal cooperation that had led to multiple convictions, and that the Army was proud to have soldiers who understood that duty sometimes means protecting your family instead of serving overseas. Sixth and final call went to Colonel Stone, who'd become something between a mentor and a guardian angel during the whole federal investigation. She told me something that I'm still processing. You didn't just save your daughter. You probably saved dozens of other kids who would have been victimized by that system if it had been allowed to continue operating. That night, after dinner and homework and the kind of normal evening routine that used to seem boring but now felt like a miracle, I sat by Lily's bed while she drifted off to sleep. The machines that had been monitoring her vitals in the hospital were gone, replaced by a nightlight that projected stars on the ceiling and a stuffed elephant that she'd named Mr. Peanuts for reasons that made perfect sense to an 8-year-old. "Dad," she said, just before sleep claimed her. "Yeah, kiddo. Thank you for making the bad people go away." I sat there in the dark, listening to her breathing settle into the deep, even rhythm of a child who wasn't afraid anymore, and thought about promises and justice and the difference between revenge and responsibility. Revenge would have been showing up with a gun and settling the score the way soldiers are trained to settle scores. Justice was what we'd actually accomplished, a systematic dismantling of corruption that would protect not just Lily, but every other kid in this city who deserved to grow up safe. Revenge would have been sweet for about 5 minutes, until the consequences kicked in and I ended up in prison while Lily ended up in foster care. Justice was steady and permanent and built to last longer than the people who'd tried to break it. And my daughter wasn't a victim anymore. She was a survivor, a witness, a kid who'd helped bring down a network of corruption that had been operating for decades. She was free from fear, free from the people who'd hurt her, free to be a normal 8-year-old who worried about math homework and whether her friends would like her new haircut, instead of whether the adults who were supposed to protect her were going to hurt her instead. I kept my promise. I came fast, I fought hard, and I won. And for the first time since that phone call in Iraq, I finally let myself breathe.